The
We have
radio
to keep moving.
transmission lasted 11 seconds. A
Stay
father's
close.
voice
I'll
hoarse
protect
from
you.
smoke and fear,
Which way?
crackling through static on emergency frequency 146.52. This is Brock Harlan, 1847 Ridgeline Summit Road. Family of 4 trapped. Daughter age 6 severe asthma out of medication 24 hours. Fire closing in. GPS coordinates 3, 4.1, 847, negative 117.2934. Requesting immediate evacuation. Anyone please? My baby girl can't breathe. But the voice on the radio wasn't really the father's. Not the words, not the structure, not the calculated precision of every syllable designed to cut through static and reach the exact ears that needed to hear it. The voice belonged to Brock Harlan. The mind behind it belonged to his wife. Jolene Harlan had spent 11 minutes writing that script on the back of a cereal box with a pencil stub she'd found in Wren's Ladybug backpack. She'd chosen every word with the kind of cold surgical precision that most people associate with emergency room doctors or air traffic controllers, because Jolene had been both in a sense. 8 years as an EMT in San Bernardino County before she'd quit to raise her children. 8 years of arriving at scenes where seconds separated survival from brain damage, where the right information delivered in the right sequence to the right dispatcher meant the difference between a child going home and a family visiting a grave. She knew exactly what information a rescuer needed. GPS coordinates not a street address because nobody was coming from a mapped road. Age and weight of the patient because medication dosages depend on body mass. Specific medical condition, not just help us, because a responder carrying the wrong equipment might as well not come at all. And she'd chosen the frequency with the precision of a chess player, sacrificing a pawn to capture a queen. Not 911. She'd called 911 3 times in 3 days. The first time a dispatcher named Carol had promised a helicopter within 2 hours. No helicopter came. The second time a different dispatcher had escalated the request to the fire marshal's office. No response. The third time Jolene had asked the dispatcher a very specific question. She'd asked what priority zone means. The pause on the other end told her everything. The dispatcher's voice had gone careful the way voices go when someone is choosing between honesty and liability. It means resources are currently allocated to areas designated as critical infrastructure priority, ma'am. I'm sure your request is in the queue. Jolene had hung up the radio and sat in the smoke-filled cabin and understood with a certainty that arrives not as revelation, but as confirmation of something you already suspected, that no one was coming. Not because resources were stretched thin, not because the fire was too dangerous, because someone with a title and a desk and a color-coded map had looked at her family's address and decided they weren't worth the fuel. That's when she stopped calling 911. Frequency 146.52 was the national simplex calling frequency for amateur radio operators. Hikers monitored it. Hunters monitored it. Boy Scout troops on camping trips monitored it because their radio operators needed practice on open frequencies. And motorcycle clubs monitored it because long-distance riders used it to coordinate meetups and warn each other about road hazards and speed traps. Jolene knew this because her husband's uncle, a man the club called Gunner, had given her a handheld radio 4 years ago and told her to keep it charged and keep it close. In case the world goes sideways and the phone stopped working, he'd said, "This frequency finds family." She'd written the script for Brock to read because his voice, deep and rough from years of construction sites and motorcycle rallies, carried better through cheap radio speakers than her higher register would. She'd included "My baby girl can't breathe" because 8 years of emergency medicine had taught her that specificity triggers action, but emotion triggers urgency. A clinical description of respiratory distress makes a dispatcher type faster. A father's broken voice saying his baby can't breathe makes a human being stand up from wherever they're sitting and move. Jolene Harlan was 36 years old, brown hair tied back with a bandana that used to be white and was now gray with ash. Green eyes that carried a quality of someone who processes information faster than she speaks, which meant she often appeared calm when she was actually running 3 contingencies ahead of everyone else in the room. She stood 5'6" and weighed 132 pounds and had hands that could start an IV in a moving ambulance and splint a compound fracture in under 90 seconds. Those hands had delivered 2 babies in the field when hospital transport wasn't possible. Those hands had performed CPR on a construction worker who'd fallen 40 feet onto concrete and had kept his heart beating for 11 minutes until the helicopter landed. Those same hands had held her own daughter's face 100 times during asthma attacks, steady as stone, while her heart hammered underneath. She'd left EMS work when Ren was born. The schedule was brutal, 48-hour shifts. Holidays missed the constant proximity to death that eventually either hardens you or breaks you, and Jolene had felt herself starting to harden in ways she didn't want to bring home to a newborn daughter. But she'd never stopped thinking like an EMT. The training lived in her nervous system, automatic and permanent. Walk into any room and she'd already identified the exits, the hazards, the person most likely to need help first. Grocery store, hospital, church. It didn't matter. The part of her brain that assessed threat and calculated response never turned off. It just waited. For 3 days in that cabin, it hadn't waited. It had run at full capacity hour after hour, managing medication rationing and air quality and hydration and Brock's fracture pain and Cody's fear and Ren's slow deterioration. Managing all of it with the disciplined calm of a woman who knew from years of training that panic is a luxury you cannot afford when people depend on you. She handed the cereal box to Brock at 1:46 p.m. He read it at 1:47. And 3.8, 8 miles to the northeast, a 14-year-old boy with a burn scar on his left forearm and a dead father's topography map in his backpack heard every word. 72 hours earlier, the Harlan family had driven up Ridgeline Summit Road in a dually pickup truck, with a camper shell pulling a small utility trailer loaded with camping gear, firewood, and the kind of supplies that people who live partly off-grid bring when they're planning a long weekend in the mountains. Brock drove. He was 38 years old, 6'2", 217 pounds of construction worker muscle, built from years of framing houses and pouring foundations in the San Bernardino heat. Before the construction, before the Hells Angels Road, Captain Patch on his vest. Before the family, he'd been a combat medic in Iraq, 2 tours with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division, the kind of service that teaches you how fast a human body can fail and how little you can do about it when the equipment runs out. Jolene navigated from the passenger seat with a paper map unfolded across her lap because cell service ended at mile marker 11, and she didn't trust GPS that couldn't update. Ren sat behind Jolene in a booster seat, clutching a stuffed unicorn named Sparkle and singing a song she'd learned in 1st grade about the days of the week. Cody sat behind Brock in his car seat, asleep with his mouth open, the way 4-year-olds sleep completely and without reservation. The cabin at 1847 Ridgeline Summit was a stone and timber structure that Brock's grandfather had built in 1963. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a bathroom with gravity-fed water from a spring uphill, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire structure in winter. The foundation was native granite, the walls were 18 inches thick at the base, and the roof was corrugated steel that Brock had replaced 2 summers ago. It was a working man's cabin. No HOA, no manicured lawn, no property value worth calculating in a county assessor's spreadsheet. Just stone and timber and a view of the San Bernardino Mountains that made you understand why people lived up here even when the world told them they shouldn't. The fire started on Wednesday, October 15th, 43 miles southwest at a place called Dry Creek Junction. By Thursday morning, it had consumed 6,000 acres. By Thursday afternoon, the smoke was visible from Ridgeline Summit, a brown haze sitting on the western horizon like a bruise on the sky. Jolene watched it from the cabin porch Thursday evening while Brock grilled burgers and Ren caught fireflies in a mason jar. She'd spent enough time around Wildfire as an EMT to read smoke. The color told her fuel type. Brown meant brush and grass, which burned fast, but often ran out of fuel. The height told her intensity. This smoke climbed high, which meant the fire was generating its own wind system, pulling oxygen from the surrounding air like a living thing breathing. "We should leave tomorrow," she told Brock. He'd agreed. They'd planned to pack Friday morning and drive out by noon. But Friday morning at 6:15, Brock stepped off the porch to load the truck, and his right foot found a gap between 2 flagstones that the frost heave had opened overnight. His ankle rolled. The sound was like a green stick breaking. He went down hard, caught himself on the trailer hitch, and knew immediately from the angle and the grinding sensation that it wasn't a sprain. Jolene examined it with EMT hands. Displaced fracture of the lateral malleolus. The bone was visibly misaligned under the skin, swollen purple-black within 30 minutes. He couldn't bear weight. He couldn't work the clutch on the dually. And the dually was the only vehicle that could navigate the steep switchback road down to the highway because you needed low-range four-wheel drive and a driver who could work three pedals while steering around hairpin turns with thousand-foot drops. Jolene could drive the truck. She'd driven it before on flat highways in daylight without smoke. But Ridgeline Summit Road was 14 miles of single-lane switchbacks carved into the mountain in 1941 by the Civilian Conservation Corps. No guardrails, no shoulders, drops of 400 to 1,200 feet on the exposed side. In clear conditions with full visibility, it was a white-knuckle drive. In smoke that reduced visibility to 50 feet, and with two children in the back seat and a husband screaming every time the truck bounced over a rut, it was a calculation. Jolene made the calculation. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked west. The smoke was heavier now, not just on the horizon, but in the air, drifting through the trees like fog. She estimated visibility at 200 yards and dropping. She checked the wind. Southwest steady. That meant the fire was moving northeast toward them, but the rate depended on terrain and fuel load and a dozen variables she couldn't measure from a cabin porch. She pulled out the paper map and traced the road down. 14 miles of switchbacks. Average speed in smoke, maybe 10 miles per hour if she was aggressive, 5 if she was cautious. That meant 70 minutes to 3 hours of driving on a road where one mistake meant a 1,000-foot fall with her children in the car. Then she looked at the cabin. Granite foundation, 18-inch stone walls, metal roof, natural clearing around it where Brock's grandfather had removed trees within a 100-foot radius, not for fire safety specifically, but because he'd needed the timber and the sunlight for a garden. The spring-fed water system still worked. The stone fireplace alcove was essentially a bunker. Jolene made the decision that would save her family's lives. She decided to stay, not out of paralysis, not out of fear, out of math. The cabin's survivability in a wildfire, given its stone construction and cleared perimeter, was significantly higher than the survivability of driving two children down a 14-mile cliff road in zero visibility smoke. She was choosing the option with the lowest mortality risk. And once she'd made that choice, she began engineering their survival with the methodical intensity of someone who knew that hope is not a strategy. First, the breathing system. Wren's asthma was managed by a daily maintenance inhaler and a rescue inhaler for emergencies. They'd brought a 7-day supply for what was supposed to be a 4-day trip. But the smoke had triggered attacks on Thursday and Friday, burning through the rescue inhaler at 3 times the normal rate. By Friday evening, the rescue inhaler was empty. The maintenance inhaler had 2 days of doses remaining. Jolene inventoried every resource. She found activated charcoal in the camping water filter system. She crushed it to powder, layered it between wet cotton bandanas, and created improvised respirator masks for all 4 of them. She hung wet blankets across every window and door opening, creating a crude but functional air filtration barrier that reduced particulate matter inside the cabin by roughly 60%. She positioned Wren in the stone fireplace alcove, the most insulated and airtight space in the structure, with a wet towel draped as a curtain across the opening. She mixed a saline solution from boiled spring water and table salt, and every 2 hours she used a medicine dropper to administer small amounts into Wren's nostrils and had her inhale steam from a pot of boiling water with the saline mixed in. It wasn't albuterol, it wasn't a bronchodilator, but it kept the airways moist and reduced the viscosity of the mucus that was slowly filling her daughter's lungs. She checked Wren's breathing rate every 15 minutes by her watch. Thursday night, 20 breaths per minute, normal for a 6-year-old. Friday morning, 24, elevated but manageable. Friday evening, 28, concerning. Saturday morning, 32. The trajectory was clear. The line went in only one direction, and at the end of that line was a place Jolene could not allow her mind to visit. Not yet. Not while there was still math to do. While Jolene engineered survival inside the cabin, the system designed to rescue her family had already written them off. Fire Marshal Preston Whitmore sat in the San Bernardino County Emergency Operations Center at 0900 hours Saturday morning, studying a wall-mounted digital map that showed every active fire, every deployed unit, and every pending request in the county. The map used a color-coded system he had personally designed 4 years ago. Red for critical, orange for high priority, yellow for standard, and gray for category 3, which the official documentation described as defer until resources available. but which everyone in the department understood meant not worth the risk right now, and probably not worth the risk later either. Ridgeline Summit was gray. Preston had classified it himself on Thursday evening, 12 hours after the fire started, based on a formula he'd refined over 11 years as fire marshal. The formula was elegant in its simplicity: property value divided by access difficulty multiplied by political visibility. Meadowbrook Estates, the luxury subdivision 8 miles south, scored 9.4. Average home value $2.1 million. Access via paved 4-lane highway. Residents included a county supervisor, 2 state assemblymen's donors, and the publisher of the regional newspaper. Ridgeline Summit scored 1.8. Property value essentially 0 on the tax rolls. Access via single-lane mountain road impassable during fire conditions. Residents a construction worker with a motorcycle club affiliation and no political connections whatsoever. The formula didn't include a variable for children. It didn't include a variable for medical conditions. It didn't include a variable for the basic premise that emergency services exist to serve everyone, regardless of economic status. Those variables would have complicated the math, and Preston Whitmore had built his career on keeping the math simple. At 09:15 Saturday, he deployed 3 engine companies and 2 helicopter units to Meadowbrook Estates. Response time to Meadowbrook, 47 minutes. Response time to Ridgeline Summit, still 0. Still pending, still gray. Captain Hadley, the engine company commander assigned to the southern sector, had radioed Preston at 1000 hours with a question. "Marshal, I've got a request here from Ridgeline Summit. Family of 4 child with medical condition. We could divert 1 unit from Meadowbrook and reach them in approximately 90 minutes. Requesting authorization." Preston's response was immediate. "Negative, Captain. Meadowbrook is priority. Ridgeline is Category 3. Maintain current deployment." Hadley had paused before responding. "Understood, sir. But for the record, the child is 6 years old. And for the record, Captain, every child in Meadowbrook Estates is also someone's kid. Stay on mission." The radio had gone silent, and Preston Whitmore had returned to his map, satisfied that the system was functioning as designed. Resources flowing to where they generated the most political and economic return. Categories clearly defined. Liability carefully managed. He didn't know that Jolene Harlan had already tried 911 3 times. He didn't know that his dispatcher had used the phrase priority zone and that a former EMT with 8 years of experience had recognized exactly what that phrase meant. He didn't know that at this very moment, Jolene was writing a script on the back of a cereal box that would bypass his entire system reach years he couldn't control and trigger a chain of events that would end his career, expose a pattern of lethal discrimination stretching back 4 years, and prove that the most dangerous thing to a corrupt bureaucracy isn't a lawyer or a journalist or a politician. It's a mother with a dying child and nothing left to lose. At 1:58 p.m. Saturday, 11 minutes after Brock's voice carried Jolene's words across frequency, 146.52, a 14-year-old boy named Declan Ashford was teaching 8 younger Boy Scouts how to read topography maps at Pine Valley Campground, 3.88 miles northeast of the Harlan cabin. Declan had a burn scar on his left forearm from a campfire accident when he was 11. It was the reason he'd earned his fire safety merit badge with a 98% score. The reason he taught fire behavior to younger scouts. The reason he understood at 14 that fire wasn't evil or malicious. It was physics. Heat rises. Oxygen feeds combustion. Terrain channels wind. You respect those laws or they kill you, and there's no appeal process. His scout uniform shirt was tan with short sleeves rolled to his elbows. His cargo shorts had pockets organized like a workshop, each tool in its designated place. Compass northeast pocket, multi-tool right hip, first aid kit left cargo pocket. The wide-brimmed campaign hat sat on the picnic table next to the topography map he'd spread flat with river stones at the corners. He was pointing to Ridgeline Summit on the map, explaining contour lines to Kit Overland, the 11-year-old with a gift for navigation that bordered on supernatural, when Briggs Tully raised his hand for silence. Briggs was 13, radio operator. He wore an emergency scanner headset around his neck, the way other teenagers wore headphones as an extension of his identity. He had a talent for filtering signal from noise, for hearing the one transmission that mattered in a stream of routine traffic. "Emergency frequency," Briggs said. His voice had the quality it got when something on the airwaves wasn't routine. Quiet focused the conversational equivalent of a hunting dog going rigid. The other scouts stopped talking. Then Brock Harlan's voice filled the clearing. Every word Jolene had written, every piece of information she'd calculated would trigger a rescue. GPS coordinates, child's age, medical condition, time remaining. My baby girl can't breathe. Silence. 9 boys frozen in place, staring at a radio speaker that had just carried the sound of a father begging strangers to save his daughter because the people whose job it was to save her had decided she didn't matter enough. Kit Overland grabbed the topography map and spread it flat. His usually scattered 11-year-old energy focused into something sharp and precise. His finger found the GPS coordinates in 3 seconds. Ridgeline Summit. Right here, that's 3.88 miles southwest of our position. Declan was already leaning over the map, measuring distance against the scale with his thumb and forefinger. His mind was calculating. Elevation change, roughly 800 feet of ascent over the first 2 miles, then a descent into a saddle, then another climb. Terrain difficulty, moderate to severe rocky with dense vegetation in the valleys, but sparse granite exposure on the ridges. Fire progression, based on the smoke he could see to the southwest, moving northeast at approximately half a mile per hour, in the brush faster uphill, slower on exposed rock. Time required at double-time hiking pace with loaded packs, approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes, the same number the voice on the radio had estimated for his daughter's survival. Boys, pack up. That was Scoutmaster Ray Cosgrove, 44 years old, adult leader, already standing and reaching for his backpack. His voice carried the particular urgency that meant evacuate now, questions later. The fire is too close. We're leaving camp immediately. Everyone grab your gear. 5 minutes. But Declan wasn't moving. He was staring at the map, at that dot labeled Ridgeline Summit, at the distance, at the topography. Pinarest Ridge created a natural fire break if you approached from the northeast. Granite outcropping, sparse vegetation, bare rock face rising 30 feet above the surrounding forest. You could move parallel to the fire line instead of through it. Use the ridge as a shield. The geology channeled wind east to west across the ridge, meaning smoke would blow across their path rather than into it. Visibility would be reduced but breathable if they stayed on the northeast face. It was possible. Dangerous but possible. The kind of possible that exists only for people who understand terrain and fire behavior well enough to find the narrow corridor between suicide and salvation. Mr. Ray, Declan said quietly, still looking at the map. We can get there. Declan, no. Ray's voice went sharp with the authority of a man who'd been responsible for children's safety for 19 years. Absolutely not. Active fire zone. We evacuate away from fire, not toward it. That's basic wilderness protocol. You know that. Briggs was still holding the radio. His hand had gone white on the casing. He said his daughter can't breathe. 6 years old. Sawyer Engstrom, 13, first aid specialist. Thick black frame glasses, red hair that never stayed flat, had his first aid kit open in his lap already. Checking supplies with the meticulous intensity he brought to every medical assessment. Severe asthma without medication in heavy smoke conditions. He was calculating, his lips moving slightly. She has maybe 90 minutes before respiratory failure. Less if she's been without her inhaler for 24 hours. Maybe 70 minutes. Nash Calloway. 12 fire safety merit badge, stocky build with perpetually messy black hair, was studying the map with the same focus his wildland firefighter grandfather had taught him. Fires coming from west and north. If we approach from northeast, his finger traced a line along the topography. We use Pinarest Ridge as a natural fire break. The granite exposure creates a corridor here. Sparse vegetation, minimal fuel load. We'd be moving parallel to the fire line, not through it. He looked up. It's possible. This isn't a discussion. Ray's voice went harder. The voice of an adult who carried the weight of liability and responsibility and 9 sets of parents trusting him with their children. I'm responsible for your safety. We evacuate. Now, that's final. And that's when Declan stood up slowly. He looked at Ray, then at his 8 scouts. Sawyer with his first aid kit ready, Nash with his fire knowledge, Briggs with his radio, Kit with his navigation gift, Monty Drennan with his search and rescue training, Rowan Sutfield with his wilderness survival skills, Truett Lassiter with his emergency preparedness mind, Pax Reinhardt, the youngest, smallest, most determined. Then Declan spoke, not loud, not angry, certain with a conviction that only someone speaking from the deepest truth they know can carry. Mr. Ray, 4 years ago my father died because someone who could have helped him didn't. The clearing went silent. Every scout in Troop 47 knew Declan's story, but he rarely spoke about it this directly. A crane operator saw a cable fraying. He had 90 seconds to hit the emergency stop and clear the workers. He didn't stop the crane because the delay would cost overtime pay, and his shift supervisor would write him up. The cable snapped. The crane's load dropped. My dad and 2 other workers died instantly. His voice stayed level, but his hands weren't steady. They were gripping the edge of the picnic table hard enough to whiten his knuckles. I was 10 years old when I buried my father, and I made a promise at his grave that I would never be that person. I would never know someone needed help and choose not to act because it was dangerous or inconvenient, or because someone with authority told me it wasn't my problem. He looked at the radio where Brock's voice had been. There's a 6-year-old girl, 3.8 miles from where we're standing. She's dying because every adult with the power to help her decided she wasn't worth the risk. We can hear her father begging. We can reach her. We have the training, first aid, fire safety, wilderness survival, search and rescue communications, orienteering, emergency preparedness, climbing. Every merit badge we ever earned. This is why we earned them. Not for a patch on a sash, for this. He looked at each of his scouts. A scout is helpful. A scout is brave. A scout is loyal. We don't abandon people because it's dangerous. We don't walk away because someone in authority tells us to. I'm going. Anyone who wants to come with me, grab your gear. Anyone who doesn't, I understand completely. But I'm going, on my honor. For 5 seconds, nothing moved. The smell of distant smoke hung in the air. A bird called somewhere in the canopy and went unanswered. Then Sawyer Engstrom stood first, grabbed his first aid kit, walked to stand beside Declan without saying a word. Nash Calloway stood, grabbed fire blankets and safety gear, positioned himself at Declan's left shoulder. Briggs Tully checked his radio. Battery tightened his headset strap, stood behind Declan with his hand already near the transmit button. One by one, all 8 scouts stood and gathered their gear. No discussion, no debate. They moved as a single unit, each one finding their position in the formation like they'd rehearsed this moment for years. Because in a way they had. Every camping trip, every training exercise, every merit badge class had been preparation for exactly this. Sawyer positioned at Declan's right first aid kit secure across his chest. Nash at Declan's left fire safety equipment ready. Briggs behind hand on radio. Kit unfolded the full topography map finger already tracing the safest route. Monty checked his watch, calculating timeline. Rowan tested wind direction, reading the air with his fingertip held high. Truitt divided emergency supplies into 9 equal packs. Pack secured climbing rope to his belt. Then they spoke, one by one, like a roll call that nobody had ordered. Sawyer, the scout oath says help other people at all times, not when it's safe, not when adults approve, at all times. Nash, my grandfather fought Wildfire for 29 years. He always said fire takes the people nobody fights for. We're fighting. Kit, the quietest scout, now firm. Everyone says I'm too young to matter. Today I proved them wrong. Monty, search and rescue training. Step 1, locate the victim. Step 2, extract the victim. There is no step 3 that says, unless it's hard. Rowan, the land provides for those who respect it. The land will protect us today. Truitt, I calculated the risks. Yes, we could die, but she will die if we don't go. The math is simple. Pack's youngest voice cracking, but set like stone. Everyone always treats me like I'm too little. Today I'm big enough. Briggs last, hand on the radio. I'm calling them. They need to know help is coming. Declan nodded. Make the call. Briggs pressed the transmit button, and his voice went out across the frequency, clear and steady and young. Ridgeline Summit, this is Scout Troop 47 Pine Valley Campground. We copied your distress call. We're 3.8 miles northeast of your position. 9 scouts, we're coming to you, over. Inside the cabin, Jolene was checking Wren's breathing rate when Briggs's voice came through the radio. She heard the words Scout Troop, and her hand stopped moving on her daughter's back. She heard 9 scouts, and her mind immediately calculated children, not adults. She heard ages 11 to 14 from the follow-up transmission, and something in her chest clenched with a fear different from the one she'd been managing for 3 days. Brock grabbed the radio. Scout Troop. Did you say Scout Troop? How many of you? Briggs's voice came back. 9 scouts, sir. Ages 11 to 14. We have first aid, fire safety, wilderness, survival, search and rescue training. We're equipped. We're trained. And we're coming. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Over. Brock looked at Jolene. His face held the expression of a combat medic who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and knew exactly how dangerous it was for children to enter an active fire zone. His mouth opened to tell them not to come. Jolene stopped him. She put her hand on his wrist and held it there. And the look she gave him was the look of a woman who had spent 3 days calculating every possible path to her daughter's survival and had watched every single one close. 911 closed. Fire marshal closed. Self-evacuation closed. Every option gone except sitting in this cabin, counting her daughter's breaths and watching the numbers climb toward a threshold she couldn't think about. And now on a radio frequency she'd deliberately chosen because it reached people the system couldn't control, 9 children had answered. She took the radio from Brock. Troop 47, this is Jolene Harlan. I'm Ren's mother. I'm a former EMT. I need to talk to your first aid specialist right now, and I need your navigator to give me your planned route. Over. A pause. Then a different voice, younger, with the careful enunciation of someone who takes medical communication seriously. Mrs. Harlan, this is Sawyer Engstrom First Aid. I have a full trauma kit bag, valve mask, oral airways, and field medications. What's Ren's current status? Over. Jolene began giving Sawyer the clinical picture. Respiratory rate 38 and climbing, mild cyanosis of lips and nail beds, productive cough with dark mucus indicating deep particulate penetration, no medication available, estimated blood oxygen in the mid to high 80s based on clinical signs, trending toward critical threshold within 90 minutes. She spoke to him as she would speak to a paramedic on scene. No simplification, no condescension. She listed every symptom, every intervention she'd already attempted, every resource she had and didn't have. And Sawyer absorbed it all with the focus of someone who understood that this information would determine whether a child lived or died. Then she called for the navigator. Kit Overland's voice came through. Mrs. Harlan, we're planning to take Pinarest Ridge from the northeast, bearing 225 degrees, following the granite exposure to minimize vegetation and fire risk. Total distance, 3.88 miles elevation gain, 820 feet with a descent into the saddle at mile 2.1. Jolene closed her eyes and pulled the topography of Ridgeline Summit from memory. She'd hiked this area for 6 years with Brock. She knew every ridge, every draw, every drainage channel, and she knew something Kit couldn't know from a map. She pressed transmit. Kit listened carefully. Your planned route takes you through the Pinarest Saddle at mile 2.1. That saddle funnels wind from the southwest. In current conditions, the fire will push through that gap. I can see the smoke column from my window, and it's bending east at the saddle height. That means you'll hit heavy smoke and possibly direct fire at exactly the point where you're most exposed and most tired from the climb. She paused to let that register. Change your route. At mile 1.4, where the granite outcrop splits into 2 fingers, take the eastern finger instead of the western one. It adds 0.4 miles but keeps you on the lee side of the ridge the entire way. The wind pushes smoke west across the ridge top, not down the eastern face. You'll have cleaner air and better visibility all the way to our position. Kit's voice came back. I see the split on the map. Eastern finger mile 1.4. That brings us to Ridgeline Summit from the southeast instead of the southwest. Adds maybe 12 minutes to our ETA. Jolene looked at Ren. The little girl's chest was heaving with the effort of each breath. Her eyes were half closed. The purple unicorn t-shirt, the one with grass stains from playing in the yard 4 days ago, when this was still supposed to be a fun camping trip, was gray with ash. 12 minutes was 12 minutes closer to the line Jolene couldn't think about. But dead scouts couldn't save anyone. Take the eastern finger, she said. The 12 minutes keep you alive to reach us. If you take the western route and hit fire at the saddle, you'll lose more than 12 minutes. You'll lose everything. Roger that, Mrs. Harlan. Eastern finger at mile 1.4, new ETA 102 minutes. Jolene released the transmit button and looked at Brock. She just sent 9 children into a wildfire and she just told them how to survive it. Brock's eyes were wet. He reached for her hand. You put them on the right path, he said. I put them on a path, she answered. Now we find out if it's enough. At 2:03 p.m., 9 Boy Scouts began hiking southwest at double-time pace following a route modified by a woman trapped in a burning cabin who'd read the smoke and the wind and the mountain better than any satellite map could. Behind them, Scoutmaster Ray Cosgrove watched them disappear into the tree line. He stood there for exactly 7 seconds. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed the only number he could think of that might matter. The call went to the Hells Angels Inland Empire Chapter Clubhouse. Ray didn't have the number memorized. He'd looked it up right there standing in a campground, watching 9 boys walk toward fire, because Declan had mentioned once months ago that the family they were saving had connections to the motorcycle club. The phone rang 4 times. A gruff voice answered. "This is Ray Cosgrove, Scoutmaster Troop 47. I need to get a message to your chapter president. 9 of my Boy Scouts just went into the Ridgeline Summit Fire Zone to rescue a family named Harlan, Brock Harlan. His uncle is someone you call Gunner. Those boys are doing what the fire marshal refused to do, and if they die out there because the system wouldn't help, I will make sure every camera in this state knows about it." The voice on the other end went quiet for 2 seconds. Then it said, "Hold the line." Meanwhile, in the Emergency Operations Center, Preston Whitmore was reviewing afternoon deployment schedules when his deputy handed him a note. It was a message from Captain Hadley's radio operator. A Boy Scout troop had transmitted on open frequency that they were entering the Ridgeline Summit Fire Zone on foot to evacuate the Harlan family. Preston read the note twice. His first thought was liability. If those children died in a fire zone, he'd classified as Category 3. The question would be asked, why was the zone unserved? Why were children attempting a rescue that professional units should have handled? His second thought was optics. If those children succeeded, the question would be worse. Why did 9 Boy Scouts accomplish what the fire marshal's office refused to attempt? His third thought, and this was the thought that would define the rest of his career, was not about the children at all. It was about the cameras. News helicopters were already in the air covering the fire. If they spotted 9 kids in Scout uniforms hiking through smoke, the footage would be irresistible. And if that footage aired next to dispatch logs showing he'd deployed everything to the wealthy subdivision, while a 6-year-old girl with asthma suffocated in a cabin, his career wouldn't survive the news cycle. Preston picked up his radio. "Get me a helicopter to Ridgeline Summit. Priority." His deputy looked confused. "Sir, you classified Ridgeline as Category 3 this morning. I'm reclassifying it. Get me a helicopter." But every helicopter was already deployed to Meadowbrook Estates, exactly where Preston had sent them. The earliest one could be redirected was 4:15 p.m., nearly 2.5 hours from now. Preston Whitmore sat in his operations center and understood with a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with self-preservation, that 9 Boy Scouts were about to expose the one thing he'd spent 11 years making sure nobody ever looked at too closely. The formula, the map, the gray zones, the places where people went to while he protected property values. He loosened his tie, he checked his phone. 3 missed calls from the county supervisor's office. Not about the Scouts. Not yet. Those calls were about Meadowbrook Estates, making sure the wealthy subdivision had adequate coverage, making sure the photo opportunities were arranged for the supervisor's re-election website. But the calls about the Scouts would come. They'd come when the news helicopters caught the footage. They had come when someone in a newsroom connected the dots between 9 children entering a fire zone and a fire marshal who had classified that zone as not worth saving. Preston had survived 11 years by making sure the dots never connected. Complaints were filed and lost. Dispatch logs were archived in systems nobody audited. Response time data was reported in averages that smoothed out the disparities between rich neighborhoods and poor ones. He'd built a system so bureaucratically elegant that you could look directly at the evidence of bias and see nothing but efficient resource management. But 9 Boy Scouts in uniform hiking through smoke to save a child was an image that no amount of bureaucratic language could neutralize. An image that made people ask the one question Preston had spent his entire career avoiding. Why didn't you go instead? Back in the cabin, Jolene was doing what she did best. She was managing chaos with math. Ren's breathing rate was now 38 per minute, trending upward. The steam treatments were holding the mucus loose enough that Ren could still cough it up, but each coughing fit was weaker than the last. The 6-year-old's diaphragm was fatiguing. The muscles that powered her breathing were running out of strength, like a marathon runner hitting the wall at mile 20. Jolene calculated the intersection point, the rate of respiratory decline versus the ETA of the Scouts. 90 minutes for the Scouts to arrive. Ren's breathing could sustain consciousness for approximately 80 minutes at current trajectory. That left a 10-minute buffer. Narrow, dangerously narrow. Any complication, a wind shift that slowed the Scouts, a spike in smoke density that accelerated Ren's decline, and the buffer evaporated. She needed to buy time. She looked at the cabin's resources with fresh eyes. The wood stove was cold because she'd killed the fire 2 days ago to reduce smoke inside, but the flue was still open. An open flue in a stone chimney with the front door sealed created a low-grade vacuum effect. Air from inside the cabin was drawn up the chimney and replacement air seeped in through the wet blanket barriers, which filtered some particulates. But she could reverse the flow. If she sealed the flue and opened a single small gap in the east-facing window, the prevailing southwest wind would create positive pressure on the cabin's west wall and negative pressure on the east wall. Air would flow from west to east through the cabin, entering through the thick, wet blanket barrier on the west side, which filtered it, and exiting through the east window gap. Net effect, a continuous slow flush of filtered air through the interior. Not clean air, not safe air, but cleaner than the stagnant, smoke-laden air they'd been breathing. She sealed the flue with wet rags packed tight. She cracked the east window 2 inches. She felt the air shift within minutes. A subtle current west to east pulling through the wet blanket barriers like a giant air filter made of cotton in desperation. She rechecked Ren's breathing rate 15 minutes later. Still 38, not climbing. The flush had stabilized the rate of decline, stretching the buffer from 10 minutes to perhaps 25. It wasn't enough to save her daughter, but it was enough to keep her alive long enough for 9 scouts to cross 3.88 miles of burning mountain. Jolene sat beside Ren in the fireplace alcove, one hand on her daughter's back, counting breaths, the other holding the radio, listening to Briggs Tully's updates every 15 minutes, tracking 9 dots moving across a mental map of terrain she knew by heart. She was the architect of this rescue. Every element flowed from decisions she'd made, the frequency she'd chosen, the script she'd written, the route she'd redirected, the medical instructions she'd transmitted, the air system she'd improvised. Each one a thread she'd woven into a net stretched across the gap between her daughter and death. Ren stirred, her eyes open, glassy and unfocused, looking up at her mother's face. "Mommy, when are the helpers coming?" Jolene brushed ash from Ren's forehead. The girl's skin was hot, but not with fever. With effort, with the work of breathing through lungs that were slowly filling with the mountain's breath. "Soon, baby. The scouts are coming," they promised. Ren's hand found her empty inhaler, one she'd been shaking every few minutes for 2 days, hoping for one more puff of the medicine that let her breathe without fighting. She shook it. Click. Empty. She shook it again. Click. Jolene gently took the inhaler from her daughter's hands and replaced it with Sparkle, the stuffed unicorn. "Hold on to Sparkle. Sparkle's brave, just like you." Ren clutched the unicorn to her chest with both hands. Her next breath came in with a sound that filled the cabin, a wet, rattling wheeze audible from 10 feet away, the sound of air forcing its way through passages that were closing, narrowing, surrendering inch by inch to inflammation and mucus and the relentless invasion of wildfire smoke. Jolene counted. 1 breath, 2, 3, 38 per minute, holding steady. The flush system was working. 25 minutes of buffer. 9 scouts at a double-time pace on a route she'd designed to keep them alive. The math was possible. Barely, but possible. She keyed the radio. "Troop 47, this is Jolene. Status update. Over." Briggs's voice came back slightly winded from the pace. "Mrs. Harlan, we're at mile marker 1.2, approaching the granite split. Visibility moderate, smoke present but breathable. All 9 scouts in good condition. Heading for eastern finger per your instructions. Over." Jolene looked at her watch. They were slightly ahead of schedule. Good pace. When you reach the eastern finger, the terrain drops into a shallow bowl at mile 2.3. Don't stop in the bowl. It'll collect smoke like a bathtub. Push through to the next rise and take your water break there. Higher ground, cleaner air. Roger that. No stop in the bowl. Water break at the rise past mile 2.3. And Sawyer, Jolene added. The first aid specialist's voice came on. "Yes, ma'am. When you reach us, Ren's breathing rate will be above 40. Her lips and fingernail beds will be blue. She will look like she's dying, and you need to be ready for that. Position the bag valve mask before you kneel beside her. Have your oral airway sized and ready. 20 compressions per minute. Smooth and steady, not fast. If you squeeze too fast, you'll hyperinflate a 6-year-old's lungs and make everything worse. 20 per minute. Count out loud if you have to. And Sawyer, when you see her, she's going to be scared. Talk to her while you work. Tell her your name. Tell her the scouts keep their promises. She needs to hear a calm voice more than she needs perfect technique. Do you understand? A pause, then Sawyer's voice steady despite everything. I understand, Mrs. Harlan. 20 per minute. Stay calm. Talk to her. We'll take care of her. Jolene released the transmit button and pressed the radio against her forehead and closed her eyes. She just prepared a 13-year-old boy to breathe for her dying daughter. She'd given him the instructions she would give a paramedic arriving at a scene, because that's what he was now. Not a child with a merit badge, a first responder at the most important call of his life. She opened her eyes and looked at Ren. They're coming, baby, just hold on a little longer. Ren didn't answer. She was past answering. Her eyes were half-lidded, focused on something Jolene couldn't see the way very young children look when their bodies are consuming every available resource just to maintain the most basic functions. Breathing, heartbeat, the flicker of consciousness that separates a child in crisis from a child who has crossed into a place where rescue becomes recovery. Jolene had seen that look before, in ambulances, in emergency rooms, on roadsides where the metal was still hot and the sirens were still far away. She knew what it meant and how much time it bought. Not enough, never enough, but more than zero, and more than zero was all she'd been working with for 3 days. She pulled Ren closer into her lap, careful not to change the angle of her airway, and wrapped both arms around her daughter's small body. 43 pounds. She'd weighed her 2 weeks ago at the pediatrician's office. A routine visit where Dr. Claire Pemberton had adjusted Ren's asthma management plan and written refill prescriptions that were now sitting in a pharmacy 70 miles away, useless, while the 6-year-old who needed them fought to draw each breath. Ren's fingers were still curled around Sparkle the unicorn. Her grip had loosened in the last hour, but she hadn't let go. Some part of her was still holding on, still present, still fighting with the stubbornness that Jolene recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 36 years. Outside, the fire roared. Inside, a mother counted breaths. And somewhere on a granite ridge between them, 9 boys were running toward the sound of both. The hike began at 2:03 p.m. with Kit Overland on point topography map in his left-hand compass in his right, calling out terrain changes every 30 seconds, with the quiet precision of someone whose brain translated contour lines into physical landscape, the way a musician reads sheet music into sound. Bearing 225 degrees. Elevation rising, ground stable packed granite with loose scree at the margins. Next checkpoint, the split at the outcrop, 600 meters. Nash Calloway walked second reading fire behavior with the eye his wildland firefighter grandfather had trained into him. Not just where the fire was, but where it wanted to go. Wind shifting south-southwest at the canopy level. Good for us. Pushes the main fire body west of our route. Smoke density is climbing, but we're still in breathable range. Stay below the ridgeline where the air pools cooler. Declan walked third, setting the pace. Not too fast because they needed to arrive functional, capable of performing medical interventions and structural assessments, not doubled over and gasping. Not too slow because somewhere inside a stone cabin, a 6-year-old girl's breathing rate was climbing toward a number that meant brain cells dying by the thousand with each passing minute. He kept the pace at what scouts called a ranger walk, fast enough to cover ground, controlled enough to sustain for 90 minutes under load. His father's blue and gold neckerchief hung from his backpack strap, where he'd tied it before they left camp, visible to every scout behind him, a reminder of why they were here and who they were doing it for. The formation held. Sawyer monitoring physical condition from his position at Declan's right, watching for signs of dehydration or heat exhaustion in the younger scouts. Briggs behind Declan, hand cycling between the radio and his water bottle. Monty Drennan watching the flanks for terrain hazards, deadfalls, and loose rock, and the kind of ground that collapses without warning under a hiking boot. Rowan Sutfield reading the air testing wind shifts with a wet fingertip held above his head every few minutes. Truett Lassiter tracking supply consumption, making sure every scout was drinking at the right intervals. Pax Reinhardt at the rear climbing rope, coiled at his belt, ready for any obstacle that required vertical movement. 9 boys moving through smoke and heat, with a discipline that comes not from authority, but from shared purpose. No one had ordered them into formation. No one had assigned positions. They'd found their roles the way a river finds its channel, naturally, inevitably, because this is what 7 years of training together looked like, when the training stopped being practice and became real. At 2:19 p.m., 16 minutes in, Briggs keyed the radio. Ridgeline Summit, Troop 47, currently 0.9 miles from start position, approaching the granite split, all 9 scouts moving well. How's Ren over? Jolene's voice came back strained but controlled. The voice of a woman managing a clinical emergency with one hand and a radio with the other. Respiratory rate 40. Lips are darker blue. She's not talking anymore, just wheezing. I'm maintaining steam treatments and the air flush system is holding, but the trajectory hasn't changed. She's declining. How fast are you moving? Declan took the radio. Fast as we can, Mrs. Harlan. We're about to hit the split. Heading for the eastern finger, like you said. We'll be through the bowl section in 20 minutes and into the final approach. Good. When you pass through the bowl at mile 2.3, don't slow down for anything. That section collects smoke and heat. You'll feel the temperature spike and visibility will drop to maybe 30 feet. It'll feel wrong. Your instinct will tell you to stop and assess. Don't stop. Push through. 60 seconds at pace gets you through the worst of it and on to the rise beyond. The air clears fast once you're past the low point. Declan repeated the instruction back. Through the bowl, don't stop 60 seconds to clear air. And Declan, Jolene added, yes, ma'am. You're doing something most adults wouldn't do. I need you to keep doing it for 71 more minutes. Can you do that? Declan looked at his 8 scouts, Sawyer adjusting his first aid kit strap, Nash scanning the fire line to the west with narrowed eyes, Kid already tracing the next segment of their route, Pax at the rear, shortest legs in the formation, matching the pace without complaint. Yes, ma'am. 71 minutes. They hit the granite split at 2:24 p.m. The outcrop rose before them like the prow of a ship breaking through a sea of pine and manzanita. 2 ridges extending southwest from the main formation, one western, one eastern, separated by a gap of roughly 200 yards. The western finger was the direct route to Ridgeline Summit, shorter by almost half a mile and visibly hazed with smoke that moved across its face in thick rolling sheets. The eastern finger was clear. Not clean, nothing was clean anymore, but the air on its leeward face was translucent gray instead of opaque brown. Jolene had been right. The prevailing wind pushed smoke west across the ridge top, leaving the eastern face in a relative pocket of breathable air. Kit pointed east without hesitation. This way, Mrs. Harlan's route. They turned east and began the traverse. 23 miles to the southwest, at the same moment 9 scouts made their turn onto the eastern finger. A man named Gunnar Harlan stood into the parking lot of the Hells Angels Inland Empire Clubhouse with a phone in his right hand and his prosthetic left hand resting on the fuel tank of a 1992 Harley-Davidson Fat Boy that he'd ridden for 31 years. Gunnar was 58 years old, 6'1", full gray beard trimmed close enough to fit inside a helmet, eagle tattoo on his left forearm from his Army Ranger days. The ink faded to blue-green the way military tattoos fade after decades of sun. His left hand was a custom prosthetic matte black titanium with articulated fingers built to grip a motorcycle throttle designed and paid for by a VA specialist who'd understood that for some veterans, the motorcycle isn't recreation, but survival. He'd lost the hand in '87. Motorcycle accident on the Angeles Crest Highway, a blown tire at 65 miles per hour, 300 feet of road rash, and a hand that the surgeons couldn't save. He'd spent 4 months at the VA hospital learning to operate the prosthetic, and the first thing he'd done when they discharged him was ride his motorcycle home one-handed because nobody tells a Ranger he can't ride. He'd been club president for 19 years. Before that, sergeant at arms for 8. Before that, a prospect who'd earned his patch by riding from San Bernardino to Sturgis and back in February in rain on a bike with no windshield because the club's founding members believed you proved your commitment through discomfort and the willingness to endure what softer people wouldn't. He'd led 3 missing child searches that police had abandoned, found all 3 kids alive. He'd organized disaster relief after the 2003 Wildfire and the 2015 North Fire, deploying club members with trucks and tools and supplies, while official agencies were still filing paperwork. 5 decades of watching institutions fail had taught him that the distance between a system that's supposed to help and a system that actually helps is often measured in leather and chrome and the willingness to show up when nobody asks you to. He'd heard about the Ridgeline Summit situation from 2 sources simultaneously. Ray Cosgrove's phone call to the clubhouse, relayed by the prospect on duty, and Jolene's voice on frequency 146.52, which Gunnar monitored on a scanner mounted to his garage workbench. It was Jolene's voice that moved him, not Brock's distress call. That had been urgent, frightening, the sound of a father losing his child. But it was Jolene's voice, calm and clinical and absolutely in command, directing a 13-year-old through pediatric ventilation protocols while her daughter lay dying 10 feet away, that made Gunnar set down his coffee and walk to the parking lot and pull out his phone. Because Gunnar recognized that voice. Not the person speaking, though he knew Jolene and respected her in the specific way that men of his generation respect competence. He recognized the sound of it, the controlled steadiness that masks active terror, the precision that emerges when a trained professional runs out of institutional support and falls back on nothing but skill and will, and the absolute refusal to let the people they love die without a fight. He'd heard that sound in Kuwait, squad leaders calling for medevac with the same tone while their soldiers bled out in the sand, radio operators directing fire support with bullets cracking past their ears. The voice of someone holding the line alone, because the line is all that stands between the people behind them and something unthinkable. If Jolene Harlan was directing a rescue from inside a burning cabin, using Boy Scouts as her field team, then the situation had already gone past the point where phone calls to county officials would matter. It was past the point where polite requests through proper channels would produce results. It was at the point where you either showed up with enough force to make the system move, or you watched it crush the people caught beneath it. But before Gunnar activated the phone tree, he did something else first. He picked up the radio scanner from his workbench, switched to frequency 146.52, and called the scouts directly. At 2:34 p.m., exactly 91 minutes before Ren Harlan would hit the critical oxygen threshold that separated recoverable damage from permanent loss, Briggs's radio crackled with a new voice. Not Jolene, not Brock. Older, gravelly, controlled anger underneath every calm syllable. Scout Troop 47. This is Gunnar Harlan, call sign War Chief President of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Inland Empire Chapter. Brock is my nephew. You're hiking into a wildfire to save his family. Is that correct? Over. Declan took the radio. Yes, sir. 9 scouts, ET. A 67 minutes to Ridgeline Summit. We have medical supplies, fire safety equipment, and emergency rations. We'll stabilize the family and coordinate extraction. Over. A long pause, the sound of wind, the distant rumble of engines already gathering. Son, I'm 58 years old. Army Ranger, served in Kuwait. Been in this club 43 years. Led 3 missing child searches that police gave up on. Found all 3 kids alive. I've seen brave. I've seen loyal. I've seen brothers ride into hell for each other. But 9 kids between 11 and 14 running into a wildfire to save my family. That's the bravest thing I've witnessed in 5 decades. Another pause, longer. Here's what's happening. I'm making a call right now. Code Black, family emergency, minors in danger. Within 30 minutes, every brother within 50 miles will be rolling toward Ridgeline. We'll bring fire trucks, medical equipment, water tankers, bulldozers for fire breaks. We'll bring numbers. And when you bring my family out of that fire, we'll be there to make sure they get home safe. Declan's throat went tight. Sir, we're just trying to help. I know, son. That's why we're coming. Because if 9 boys can do what every adult authority in this county refused to do, the least we can do is back you up. War Chief out. The radio went silent. Declan looked at his 8 scouts. They'd all heard every word. Nash said quietly, we're not alone anymore. Declan adjusted his pack strap. We were never alone. We had each other. He turned back to the trail and set the pace again. 3 minutes after signing off with the scouts, Gunnar activated the phone tree. It worked the way it had worked for 40 years. President calls Sergeant at Arms. Sergeant calls Road Captain. Road Captain sends the group text. The text went out at 2:37 p.m. 3 words. Angel down, Ridgeline. In the Hells Angels, Angel down means a brother is in mortal danger. It is the one call that overrides everything. Work schedules, personal conflicts, old grudges, family dinners, doctor's appointments. Nothing supersedes Angel down. You hear it, you ride. That's not a suggestion, that's the oath. By 2:48 p.m., 58 members of Inland Empire Chapter had responded with a single word. Route. By 3:11 p.m., 41 members of Riverside Chapter were rolling. By 3:29 p.m., 37 members of San Bernardino Chapter were mobilizing. By 3:44 p.m., 33 members of Victorville Chapter, a chapter that hadn't ridden with Inland Empire in 9 years, due to a territory dispute that began with a bar fight in 2015 and escalated into a blood feud that left 2 members hospitalized and produced the kind of silence between brothers that hardens into something that feels permanent, heard the call. Their president, a man called Ridgeback, made the decision in 30 seconds. The way the story was told later, Ridgeback was in his garage changing his oil when his phone buzzed with the forwarded message. He read it, set down his wrench, and called his road captain. His road captain said, "Gunners calling Angel down after what happened in 15." And Ridgeback said, "9 kids between 11 and 14 are doing what we should be doing. They're hiking into a wildfire to save Gunner's nephew's family. His 6-year-old niece is dying. And we're sitting here holding a grudge over a bar fight from a decade ago. Put out the call. Old beef doesn't matter when children are in the fire." 8 independent riders, solo bikers, not affiliated with any chapter, heard the emergency transmission on open frequency and showed up because, as one of them said later to a reporter, "If Boy Scouts are risking their lives for a brother's family, I don't need a patch on my vest to know where I'm supposed to be." Total mobilization: 177 Hells Angels plus support vehicles. The largest single chapter response in Southern California Hells Angels history. The previous record was 134 brothers for a killed member's funeral in 2019. This broke that record because 9 scouts had shamed every adult within radio range into remembering what mattered. Declan adjusted his pack strap. "We were never alone. We had each other." He turned back to the trail and set the pace again. At 3:01 p.m., the troop reached the halfway point at Pinarest Ridge. The granite outcrop rose around them like a cathedral made of stone, its surfaces warm from the fire's radiant heat, but not dangerous, not yet. The sky above was a churning canopy of gray and orange lit from beneath by the fire line burning half a mile to the west. The sound was constant now, a low, sustained roar like standing next to a highway at rush hour, punctuated by the sharp crack of trees exploding as their sap boiled and burst their bark. "Water break," Declan called. 2 minutes. Check your gear." Nobody sits down. If you sit, your muscles cool and stiffen, and the next mile becomes twice as hard. Sawyer moved through the group with practiced efficiency. "Monty, your breathing's heavy. Slow your inhales. Deep and controlled, not short and fast. Pax, drink more water. You're not drinking enough. I can tell by your lips. Briggs, let me see your hands. Those are blisters starting. Keep them clean and don't pop them." Briggs keyed the radio while Sawyer taped his palms. "Ridgeline Summit Troop 47, halfway point reached. ETA 39 minutes. Status update on Ren, over." Jolene's voice came back. Thinner now, the calm still there, but stretched tight the way fabric stretches just before it tears. "Respiratory rate 41. She's not responding to verbal stimulation. Blood oxygen, I'm estimating high 80s based on cyanosis progression. We're close to critical. Please move fast." Sawyer took the radio. "Mrs. Harlan, this is Sawyer. When we arrive, I'll have the bag valve mask positioned and ready before I kneel down beside her. 20 compressions per minute, smooth and steady, just like you taught me. Oral airway size for a 6-year-old standing by. I've rehearsed the sequence 11 times on the hike. I'm ready. Over." A pause. When Jolene spoke again, her voice carried something it hadn't carried before. Not gratitude, something deeper. Recognition. One trained responder acknowledging another. "You'll do fine, Sawyer. Trust your hands. They know what to do. And when you see her, remember she's been fighting for 3 days. She's tougher than she looks." Sawyer clipped the radio back to Briggs's harness and looked at Declan. 39 minutes. Then we better move." At 3:31 p.m., a news helicopter appeared overhead. Not an evacuation helicopter. Not a rescue aircraft. A media helicopter drawn by reports trickling through emergency scanner traffic that a Boy Scout troop had entered the Ridgeline Summit fire zone on foot. The cameraman leaned out the open door and pointed his lens straight down. What he saw would be broadcast live within 10 minutes, go viral within an hour, and force every question that Preston Whitmore had spent 11 years avoiding. 9 boys in Scout uniforms moving through a landscape of smoke and ash and burning trees with the disciplined formation of a military patrol. Their faces were smeared with soot. Their uniforms were darkened with sweat and grime. Their legs moved in synchronized rhythm, a unison that doesn't come from marching drills, but from shared exhaustion and shared purpose, and the shared understanding that stopping is not an option. The footage was extraordinary, not because of production quality or dramatic camera angles, but because of what it showed. Children doing the work of adults. Children moving toward danger while every system designed to protect them had moved away. The contrast was so stark, so visually undeniable, that no amount of bureaucratic explanation could soften it. But the Scouts didn't know they were being filmed. They just kept hiking. At 3:46 p.m., 8 minutes ahead of schedule with 44 minutes remaining, before Wren hit the critical oxygen threshold, Declan's troop emerged from the tree line. Jolene's improvised air flush system in the cabin had bought them that margin, stretching what should have been a 4:05 deadline to 4:30 by reducing the rate of smoke penetration into Wren's lungs. 25 extra minutes engineered from wet blankets in a cracked window and a mother's understanding of airflow dynamics. The difference between arriving too late and arriving just in time. And saw the Harlan cabin. It was still standing. Barely. The surrounding trees were burned to black skeletons, their branches gone, their trunks still smoking. Ash drifts 3 feet deep covered the clearing like gray snow. The cabin's metal roof was scorched dark and warped at the edges from radiant heat. The windows were covered with wet blankets that had dried and stiffened and turned from white to the color of old coffee. But the stone walls held. The granite foundation that Brock's grandfather had laid in 1963 had done exactly what granite does in a fire. It endured. Declan cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted across the clearing. "Ridgeline Summit, this is Troop 47. We're here." The cabin door opened. Jolene came out first. Not Brock. Jolene. She walked through the door, carrying Wren in her arms because Brock couldn't walk. His fractured ankle had swollen to the point where he couldn't stand, and Jolene had been carrying both children, one in her arms and one by the hand, for the last 48 hours whenever movement was necessary. Wren was limp. Her arms hung at her sides. The purple unicorn t-shirt was gray with ash, the grass stains from 4 days ago invisible under layers of soot. Sparkle the unicorn was still clutched under one arm, held there by muscle memory, even as the rest of her body surrendered to exhaustion. Her lips were a shade of blue that Sawyer recognized immediately from his first aid training as severe cyanosis. Her chest was heaving with rapid shallow breaths, 43 per minute, each one producing a wet, rattling wheeze that carried across the clearing like something mechanical breaking down. Her eyes were half closed. She was conscious but barely occupying that narrow corridor between awareness and the kind of unconsciousness that doesn't always end. Jolene looked at 9 boys in scout uniforms, standing at the edge of her clearing, covered in ash and sweat, backpacks loaded, eyes wide but hands steady. She looked at them and her face did something that none of the scouts expected. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She didn't express relief. She went to work. Sawyer front and center. Take her. Declan. I need Nash to check the cabin's west wall for structural compromise. The fire got close. Briggs contact Gunner. Tell him we need helicopter, medevac at these coordinates. Tell him to relay to any agency that will listen. Kit, I need a flat clearing at least 40 feet square for a landing zone. Mark it with something bright. Monty Brock is inside with a fractured ankle. He needs to be carried. Assess him and figure out how to move him. Rowan, the spring is 200 yards northeast behind the boulder pile. I need clean water for Wren's airway treatments. Truett inventory, what you brought, and tell me exactly what medications and equipment we have. Pax, I need you on that high rock to the south. Watch the fire line and tell me if anything changes. Go. She gave 9 orders in 12 seconds. Every scout moved instantly. Not because she was an adult and they were children, because she was a commander and they were her team, and every order was specific, logical, and aimed at keeping people alive. Sawyer ran forward, hands already reaching. Mrs. Harlan, I need to take her now. I'm ready. Jolene looked at this 13-year-old boy with thick glasses and a first aid kit that looked too heavy for his frame and red hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and she made the decision in a quarter of a second, the same way she'd made decisions as an EMT, assessing competence not by age or appearance, but by the steadiness of the hands and the focus in the eyes. Sawyer's hands were steady. His eyes were focused. She transferred Wren into his arms. The weight of her daughter leaving her grip was the hardest physical sensation Jolene had ever experienced. Harder than any trauma call. Harder than any resuscitation. Because this was her child, and she was handing her to a boy she'd never met until 90 minutes ago on a radio frequency, and everything in her maternal biology screamed to hold on tighter, to never let go, to keep this small body pressed against her chest, where she could feel every breath and count every heartbeat. But Jolene Harlan was not a woman who let biology override logic. She let go because letting go gave Wren the best chance. Sawyer was rested. His arms were fresh. His training was specific to this moment. And Jolene's own arms were trembling from 3 days of carrying children and hanging blankets and boiling water and doing everything that needed doing, because she was the only one who could. Sawyer laid Wren on a blanket that Rowan had spread on the ground with one fluid motion. He pulled the bag valve mask from his kit, positioned it over Wren's nose and mouth. With the precision Jolene had described over the radio, checked the seal and began squeezing. 20 compressions per minute. Smooth and steady, not fast. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Wren's chest rose and fell with each compression, the air entering her lungs mechanically because her own breathing muscles had been fighting for 3 days and were losing. "I need someone to time me," Sawyer said. His voice was calm, clinical, exactly the way Jolene had told him to sound. "Count for me, 1 squeeze every 3 seconds, please." Declan knelt beside him. 1, 2, 3, squeeze. 1, 2, 3, squeeze. "Hey, Wren," Sawyer spoke to the half-conscious girl while his hands worked. "My name is Sawyer. I'm a Boy Scout. We promised we'd come get you, and Scouts don't break their promises. You're going to be okay. Just let me breathe for you for a little while. You've been working so hard. Let me take over." Wren's eyes flickered. Something moved behind them, a spark of recognition or awareness, the response of a child who hears a voice telling her she's safe and wants to believe it. Her hand moved slightly. The fingers that had been clutching an empty inhaler for 2 days, then clutching Sparkle the unicorn, now reached toward the sound of Sawyer's voice and found the fabric of his scout uniform sleeve and held on. Sawyer kept squeezing, kept talking, kept counting. Jolene watched for 15 seconds, assessing his technique with the critical eye of someone who'd supervised hundreds of field interventions. His rate was correct. His pressure was appropriate for a 6-year-old's lung capacity. His seal on the mask was tight with no visible air leak. She turned and walked back into the cabin where Brock was sitting against the wall, his fractured ankle propped on a folded blanket, his face streaked with tears and soot. "Sawyer has her," Jolene said. "He's good. He's doing it right." Brock reached for her hand. "You did this. You got them here. You kept her alive long enough." Jolene sat down beside him and for the first time in 3 days, allowed herself to lean against another person. Just for 10 seconds. Just long enough to feel the solidity of someone else's body beside her own. Then she straightened, picked up the radio, and went back to work. At 3:52 p.m., 6 minutes after the scouts reached the cabin, the sound arrived. Low at first, distant, like thunder rolling across a valley, then louder, building the way a wave builds before it breaks, except this wave was made of engines. 177 motorcycle engines converging on Ridgeline Summit from Highway 18, each one adding its voice to a chorus that shook the smoke-filled air and vibrated through the ground. Fire Marshal Preston Whitmore was standing at the Highway 18 checkpoint when he heard it. He'd driven here 20 minutes earlier, not to coordinate the rescue he'd refused to authorize, but to manage the optics. News cameras were filming, county supervisors were calling. When a story about Boy Scouts hiking into a wildfire started trending online, Preston needed to be visible, positioned at the most prominent checkpoint, demonstrating responsible command presence for any lens pointed in his direction. He wore his perfectly pressed county fire marshal uniform, polished black boots, American flag lapel pin catching the smoke-filtered afternoon light. He looked like a man in control of a crisis. He was about to discover what control actually looked like. The motorcycles came around the bend in the highway, not in chaos, not as a mob, in formation. Military-precise columns, 2 abreast, stretching back so far that Preston couldn't see where the line ended. Chrome caught what remained of the sunlight and threw it back in fragments. Leather and denim and vests heavy with patches. Engines throttled low, a sustained rumble that you didn't hear so much as feel in your teeth, in your sternum, in the soles of your feet. Front row. Gunner on the left, prosthetic hand locked to his throttle grip, face unreadable behind his riding glasses. Stonewall on the right, a saddlebag bulging with a tablet, computer, and file folders. Behind them, Inland Empire 58 strong. Behind them, Riverside 41, San Bernardino 37, Victorville 33. 8 independent riders closing the formation like a period at the end of a sentence. The column slowed. Engines throttled down to idle but didn't cut. The sound held a sustained presence that said, "We are here and we are not leaving, and you cannot make us leave." Preston stood behind the orange and white striped barricade and felt with sudden visceral clarity how small one bureaucrat looks when facing 177 citizens who have decided that enough is enough. Gunner dismounted, slowly, deliberately, Every movement calibrated for the news cameras filming from 50 yards behind the barricade. He walked toward Preston with the unhurried pace of a man who knows he's on the right side of this and has all the time in the world to prove it. Preston found his voice, the bureaucratic voice, the authority voice. Roads are closed, active fire zone, no civilian access. I'm going to need you all to turn around and Fire Marshal Whitmore. Gunner's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people listen harder. We have 9 Boy Scouts in that fire zone right now, ages 11 to 14. They're evacuating the family you classified as Category 3. They're doing your job. We're here to back them up. Preston's jaw tightened. Sir, I appreciate your concern, but I can't authorize civilian entry into an active disaster zone. There are liability issues, safety protocols. Stonewall stepped forward, pulling his tablet from the saddlebag with the smooth practice motion of a man who'd spent 22 years as a homicide detective before turning in his badge. He turned the screen toward Preston and toward every camera filming this exchange. October 18th, 11:50 a.m. Stonewall's voice had the flat professional tone of a detective reading evidence into the record. You told Captain Hadley to deprioritize Ridgeline Summit. Quote, mark them Category 3. Defer until resources available. End quote. Same day, same time, you deployed 3 engine companies and 2 helicopter units to Meadowbrook Estates. Response time to Meadowbrook, 47 minutes. Response time to Ridgeline Summit, 0. Still 0. As of right now, still 0. He scrolled the screen, dispatch logs, timestamps, resource allocation orders, everything documented. Preston felt his face flush. His eyes flicked to the cameras. He shifted posture, adjusted his tone, deployed the reasonable voice. Gentlemen, I understand you're upset, but you have to understand the impossible position I'm in. 40 active structure fires, limited resources. I have to make difficult decisions for the greater good. Sometimes that means, how long have you been making those decisions? Stonewall didn't move, didn't blink. Just ask the question the way detectives ask questions when they already have the answer in a folder. Gunner stepped closer to the barricade. Here's what's happening, Marshal. You're going to move this barrier. We're going to extract that family. Those cameras are going to film the whole thing. And tomorrow, the whole country gets to see 177 tax-paying citizens doing what their fire marshal refused to do. Preston tried the legal threat. He drew himself up, straightened his lapel pin. I have authority over this checkpoint. I have relationships with the County Board of Supervisors. One phone call and this conversation is over. Gunner gestured to Preston's radio with his prosthetic hand. Make the call right now on camera. Call your supervisor and explain why you need backup to stop citizens from rescuing a 6-year-old girl you decided wasn't worth saving. I'll wait. 5 seconds of silence. News cameras rolling. 177 engines rumbling. Preston's hand moved toward his radio, stopped, moved back to his side, because calling for backup meant admitting he needed protection from people doing the right thing. It meant confirming every accusation. It meant his career ending on live television instead of in a closed-door hearing. Gunner's voice dropped, quieter, harder. I'm not asking for authorization, Marshal. I'm giving you a choice. Move the barricade and pretend you're cooperating. Or keep it closed and explain to those cameras live right now why 177 tax-paying citizens have to force their way past you to save a child you decided wasn't worth the paperwork. He paused. Let the silence do the work. Your choice, but choose fast. Because those 9 scouts are running out of time. And unlike you, we don't calculate whether people are worth saving based on their zip code. Preston looked at this barricade, at the cameras, at 177 faces watching him with the kind of patient intensity that said, we will stand here all day and all night if that's what it takes. He'd built his career on calculations, property values and political influence, and resource optimization and liability management. 11 years of careful math that always produced the same answer: protect the people who protect your position. He'd convinced himself it was rational, efficient, smart leadership. But standing between one orange and white barrier and 177 people who decided that mercy mattered more than bureaucracy, all of that math collapsed into something very simple. Move or be moved. His hand shook as he reached for his radio. Open the barricade. His deputy, a young county fire officer who'd been watching this exchange with wide eyes and a growing awareness that he was witnessing something historic, hesitated. Sir, the protocols say. I said open it. Now, the deputy dragged the barrier aside, and 177 motorcycles rolled through. The sound was a living thing. Engines in unison, chrome catching smoke-filtered light, a river of leather and steel and brotherhood flowing past the man who'd decided they didn't matter. Gunner rode through first, made eye contact with Preston for exactly 1 second. Not triumph, not anger, just acknowledgement. You made your choice. We made ours. History is watching. Then Stonewall, then 58 Inland Empire brothers, then 41 from Riverside, then 37 from San Bernardino, then 33 from Victorville, the chapter that hadn't ridden with Inland Empire and 9-year-old feuds dissolved in the exhaust of a common purpose that made everything else seem small. Then 8 independents who'd shown up because they didn't need a charter to know right from wrong. Preston stood at his empty checkpoint barricade open, watching them disappear toward Ridgeline Summit. Every camera filmed it, every news outlet would replay it within the hour. Behind him, a reporter's voice cut through the fading engine noise. Fire Marshal Whitmore, can you explain why civilian bikers are responding to a family you classified as low priority? Preston didn't answer. He walked to his county vehicle, got in, sat behind the wheel, and stared straight ahead at nothing. His career wasn't over because of a decision. It was over because of a contrast. 9 children walking toward fire, 177 bikers riding past his barrier, and 1 fire marshal standing beside an empty checkpoint with his name on the barricade and nothing left to hide behind. At 4:02 p.m., the motorcycles arrived at the clearing outside the Harlan cabin. Sawyer Engstrom was still kneeling beside Wren. He'd been manually ventilating for 16 minutes straight, 20 compressions per minute. 320 squeezes of the bag valve mask, his forearms burning, his shoulders aching, his hands starting to cramp around the bag. He hadn't stopped, not once. Wren's color had improved slightly. The deep blue of her lips had lightened to something closer to purple. Her breathing rate, assisted by the bag valve mask, had stabilized. The immediate freefall toward critical threshold had been arrested, held in suspension, by the rhythmic action of a 13-year-old boy who had learned this skill from a merit badge class and perfected it on a 2-hour hike through a wildfire with a mother's voice in his ear telling him exactly what to do. When the first motorcycle engine cut through the clearing, Sawyer didn't look up. He kept squeezing. His job was Wren's lungs, and nothing happening outside that circle of blanket and mask and child was his responsibility. Gunner dismounted and walked directly to where Jolene stood. She'd been coordinating the entire operation from the cabin's porch radio in one hand, watching Sawyer's technique, monitoring Briggs's communications, tracking the fire line's movement through Pax's reports from the high rock. He looked at her. She looked at him. 2 people who understood command, who recognized in each other the particular exhaustion that comes from holding everyone else together while your own foundation cracks. Jolene, tell me what you need. Helicopter, medevac, priority 1. Wren needs hospital ventilation within 30 minutes, or the bag valve mask won't be enough. Brock has a displaced ankle fracture, can't walk. Cody is dehydrated and scared, but physically intact. I need your medic to take over from Sawyer. That boy's been breathing for my daughter for nearly 20 minutes, and he's going to hit muscle failure soon. And I need someone to relay our exact coordinates to any agency that can get a helicopter here. I've been calling 911 for 3 days and getting nothing. Gunner turned to his brothers and gave the orders. Stonewall coordinate helicopter medevac, call every agency, call the military if you have to. Redfield, you're our medic, take over from the scout on ventilation. Assess the whole family, prepare for air transport. Flintlock, get the news crews. Our coordinates, make sure they understand what happened here, what these scouts did, and what the fire marshal didn't. Broadside, full documentation, timeline, radio transcripts, dispatch logs, everything I want a record that can't be erased. Every brother moved instantly. Redfield, the club's medic, a 45-year-old former combat medic who'd served 2 tours and now ran a mobile medical clinic out of a converted RV, walked to Sawyer and knelt beside him. Son, I'm taking over. Show me your rhythm. Sawyer demonstrated 3 compressions without breaking pace. 20 per minute, smooth and steady. Seal's been tight the whole time, no air leak. Her color improved about 4 minutes in. Redfield watched the technique, and something shifted in his expression. This wasn't a child playing medic. This was medical-grade ventilation performed under field conditions by a teenager who'd been coached by a former EMT over a radio and hadn't deviated from protocol for 17 straight minutes. Perfect technique, Redfield said quietly. You can release. I've got her. Sawyer lifted his hands from the bag valve mask. His fingers were locked in the squeeze position, cramped and trembling, slow to uncurl. He sat back on his heels and looked at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Jolene walked to him. She didn't say thank you. She said something better. Sawyer, you gave me back my daughter. Your hands did that. Then she turned back to the operation because there was still work to do, and Jolene Harlan did not stop working until everyone was safe. At 4:11 p.m., the medevac helicopter landed in the clearing Kit Overland had marked with bright orange scout bandanas. Redfield had stabilized Wren's blood oxygen at 94% with the bag valve mask and a portable oxygen canister he had brought from his medical RV. 94%. Barely safe but stable. The threshold for brain damage was 88. They were loading Wren onto the helicopter stretcher when Jolene noticed something. Wren's breathing pattern had changed. Not the rate was controlled by the bag valve mask. The quality. Each breath produced a faint crackling sound at the base of both lungs that hadn't been there 30 minutes ago. And when Jolene pressed her ear to Wren's back, she heard it clearly, the sound of fluid where air should be. Stop. Everyone froze. Jolene placed both hands on Wren's rib cage and felt the expansion pattern. The lower lobes weren't inflating fully. The crackling was bilateral, and Wren's neck veins were slightly more prominent than they should be. She looked at Redfield. She's developing pulmonary edema. Fluid in the lungs. It's not just the asthma anymore. The smoke damage triggered an inflammatory response, and her lungs are leaking fluid into the air spaces. Redfield frowned. Edema in a pediatric patient would normally call for keeping her flat and increasing ventilation pressure. Jolene shook her head. If you increase pressure on edematous lungs, you force fluid deeper into the alveoli. She needs to be positioned upright 30 degrees at minimum to let gravity drain the lower lobes and reduce the bag rate from 20 to 15 per minute. Slower, deeper breaths. Give the fluid time to redistribute between compressions. That's the opposite of standard protocol, Redfield said. The field manual is written for healthy lungs. Jolene's voice wasn't sharp, it was precise. Wren's lungs have been fighting smoke for 3 days. They're inflamed, they're compromised, and they're now accumulating fluid. If we load her flat onto that helicopter and Redfield pumps her at 20 per minute for a 30-minute flight, she'll arrive at the hospital with her lungs full of fluid and no way to clear them. She looked directly at him. I was an EMT for 8 years. I've managed pulmonary edema in the field 9 times. Twice in children, upright position and reduced rate. That's what saves her. Redfield held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he repositioned Wren to a 30-degree incline on the stretcher, adjusted the bag valve mask rhythm to 15 per minute, and nodded. Your call, Jolene. You've been right about everything else today. They loaded Wren onto the helicopter. Jolene climbed in beside her, one hand on the bag valve mask to maintain the adjusted rhythm during flight, the other hand on Wren's forehead, gentle, constant, the touch of a mother who'd spent 3 days keeping her child alive through engineering and calculation and will, and who wasn't going to stop now. Brock was carried to the helicopter by 4 brothers, his fractured ankle splinted and stabilized. Cody walked under his own power, holding the hand of a Riverside chapter brother who had grandchildren Cody's age and knew how to keep a scared 4-year-old moving forward. Before they sealed the helicopter door, Jolene leaned out and found Declan in the crowd of scouts and bikers. Your father would be proud of you, she said, and so am I. Then the door closed and the helicopter lifted off at 4:17 p.m. Below, 9 Boy Scouts stood in a clearing surrounded by ash and smoke and the skeletal remains of burned forest. They were covered in soot, exhausted to the bone, their uniforms darkened with sweat and grime. Around them, 177 Hells Angels had formed a circle, not a threatening circle, not a wall, but a perimeter of protection. Chrome and leather surrounding tan and merit badges. Brothers surrounding brothers. News helicopters circled overhead, filming the image that would define October 18th for years to come. 9 scouts at the center, 177 bikers around them. A fire marshal's empty checkpoint miles behind. A helicopter carrying a child who was supposed to die today, climbing toward a hospital, where a doctor would later confirm that Jolene Harlan's decision to change the ventilation protocol in the final minutes before takeoff was the intervention that prevented her daughter's lungs from flooding during the flight. The doctor would use the phrase clinically decisive. She would say that without the positional adjustment and rate reduction, Wren Harlan would have arrived at Arrowhead Regional Medical Center in acute respiratory failure. But none of them knew that yet. All they knew standing in that clearing, with the fire still burning to the west and the helicopter shrinking to a dot in the eastern sky, was that a mother had kept her daughter alive for 3 days with nothing but training and improvisation. That she'd designed a rescue using children and radio waves and the topography of a mountain she'd hiked for 6 years. That she'd redirected a route and saved 9 lives. That she'd coached a 13-year-old through 20 minutes of unbroken manual ventilation in a fire zone. That she'd diagnosed a complication in the final moments and overruled protocol and been right. Gunnar stood beside Declan and watched the helicopter disappear. Your scout leader told me you made the decision to come here. That's true. The whole troop made the decision together, sir. But you spoke first. Declan touched the blue and gold neckerchief hanging from his pack. Someone had to. Gunnar reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded blue bandana worn soft from decades of road miles. This was my father's. He wore it when he rode Route 66 and 52. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he says or what he looks like. It's measured by what he does when someone needs help and nobody's watching. He handed it to Declan. You wear this. You earned it. And when people ask you where you got it you tell them a Hell's Angel gave it to a Boy Scout because that scout understood something most adults forget. Every life has exactly equal value. And if you can help, you must. Declan took the bandana with hands that weren't quite steady. Around them, the fire burned. Above them, a helicopter carried a family towards safety. And between those two facts in the space where fear meets courage and calculation meets conviction, 9 boys and 177 men stood together in ash and smoke, and the particular silence that follows the moment when ordinary people do something extraordinary and haven't yet realized what it means. 3 days after the helicopter lifted off from Ridgeline Summit, Jolene Harlan sat in a plastic chair in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit at Arrowhead Regional Medical Center, watching her daughter breathe. Not the breathing of the last 3 days. Not the wet, rattling wheeze that had filled the cabin like something mechanical failing. Not the shallow, desperate gasps that had climbed from 20 breaths per minute to 43, while Jolene counted each one on her watch and calculated the distance between this number and the number that meant permanent damage. Normal breathing, quiet, rhythmic, the effortless rise and fall of a 6-year-old chest that no longer had to fight for every molecule of oxygen. Wren was asleep. Her purple unicorn t-shirt had been replaced by a hospital gown with tiny blue bears on it. An oxygen cannula sat beneath her nose, delivering supplemental air as her lungs continued healing. An IV line ran into her left hand, taped down with gauze and decorated with a smiley face sticker that a nurse named Deborah had drawn there to make it less frightening. Sparkle the unicorn was tucked under her right arm, positioned exactly where Wren had put the stuffed animal before falling asleep, which was the same position she'd held it in the cabin, which was the same position she held it every night at home, because some things about children remain constant even when everything around them burns. Dr. Claire Pemberton, the pediatric pulmonologist who'd been managing Wren's care since the helicopter landed, walked into the room carrying a clipboard and the particular expression that doctors wear when the news is good, but the journey was close enough to bad that the good feels fragile. She sat in the chair beside Jolene. Blood oxygen on arrival was 94%, barely in the safe range but stable. The smoke damage to her lungs was significant but not permanent. We're seeing strong recovery in the bronchial tissue. The pulmonary edema you identified in the field has resolved completely with diuretic treatment. She paused and looked at Jolene the way one professional looks at another when the professional context makes gratitude feel insufficient. I need to tell you something about that edema call. The flight medic on the helicopter told me you changed the ventilation protocol before takeoff. Repositioned her upright, reduced the bag rate from 20 to 15. He said you overruled your club's field medic to do it. Jolene nodded. His protocol was right for standard asthma. It wasn't right for edematous lungs. Dr. Pemberton set down her clipboard. If Wren had been loaded flat and ventilated at the standard rate for the 30-minute flight, the fluid accumulation in her lower lobes would have progressed to acute respiratory failure. She would have arrived here in crisis, and the intervention window would have been minutes, not hours. Your decision to change the protocol was the difference between a child who recovers fully and a child who suffers permanent lung damage. She held Jolene's gaze. You saved your daughter's life at least 3 separate times in the last 72 hours. The air filtration system in the cabin, the route change that kept those scouts alive, and the edema call on the helicopter. Any one of those decisions going wrong, and we're having a very different conversation right now. Jolene didn't respond immediately. She looked at Wren, at the rise and fall of her chest, at the color in her cheeks that had returned from blue to pink, to the normal warm tone of a child who is sleeping deeply and safely. How long until she can go home? 6 weeks of breathing treatments. We're adjusting her asthma management plan with a new daily controller and keeping a rescue inhaler within reach at all times. She'll need follow-up visits every 2 weeks initially, then monthly. But she'll make a full recovery. No lasting damage, no developmental delays. She's going to live a completely normal life. Jolene closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was steady. Thank you. Dr. Pemberton stood. She paused at the door. The 13-year-old who performed manual ventilation for 20 minutes straight in an active fire zone. Sawyer, was it? Yes. His technique was flawless. Medical grade. I've seen certified paramedics with 10 years of experience who couldn't sustain that rhythm under those conditions. Whoever trained him, Jolene almost smiled. I did. Over a radio, during a wildfire. Dr. Pemberton shook her head slightly, a small involuntary gesture when reality exceeds what you thought was possible. The world needs more people like you, Mrs. Harlan. Then she left, and Jolene sat in the quiet room with her sleeping daughter and allowed herself for the first time in 4 days to stop calculating, stop planning, stop managing contingencies and timelines and oxygen percentages. For the first time since Wednesday morning, when the smoke appeared on the horizon, she let her mind go still. It lasted about 90 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls. Because Jolene Harlan was not the kind of woman who survived something and then sat quietly waiting for someone else to make sure it never happened again. The first call was to Stonewall. She'd gotten his number from Gunner at the hospital, where the club president had been camped in the waiting room for 2 days straight, sleeping in a chair, eating from vending machines, refusing to leave until he'd personally confirmed that every member of his nephew's family was stable. Stonewall, she said when he picked up, I need the dispatch logs from Preston Whitmore's office. 4 years worth. Every emergency call, every resource allocation, every classification decision. Can you get them? Already pulling them, Stonewall said. I filed a public records request through the county clerk's office yesterday. But government records requests take 30 to 60 days to process, and I don't think... I'm not waiting 60 days. Jolene's voice wasn't angry. It was precise. The way her voice got when she was solving a problem, an emotion was a variable she'd already factored in and set aside. While you wait for the official records, I need you to cross-reference the emergency call logs that are already public through the scanner archives. Every call from the last 4 wildfire seasons. Match them against the county's published response time reports. If Preston was systematically deprioritizing working-class neighborhoods, the discrepancy between actual response times and reported averages will show it. Stonewall was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a retired detective recognizing that someone has just described in 30 seconds the investigative framework that would normally take his team a week to develop. I'll have preliminary data in 48 hours, he said. Good. In Stonewall, I need you to look for fatalities. Any death in a deprioritized area where response time exceeded 6 hours. If Preston's pattern goes back 4 years, there may be people who died because he made the same decision about them that he made about my family. Understood. Jolene's second call was to Gunner. She told him what she'd asked Stonewall to do and why. Gunner listened without interrupting. Then he said, church meeting tomorrow night. You should be there. I'm not a member of your club, Gunner. No, but you're the reason my nephew's family is alive. And what you're describing isn't club business. It's community business. The brothers need to hear it from the person who figured it out. Jolene agreed. She hung up, looked at Wren one more time, and walked down the hallway to the room where Brock was lying in bed with his ankle in a surgical cast and his eyes on a television, playing news footage of 9 scouts and 177 motorcycles. She sat on the edge of his bed and told him what she was planning. Brock listened. Then he said what he always said when Jolene had decided to do something that was bigger than what most people would attempt and more necessary than what most people would recognize. Whatever you need, I'm right here. The church meeting convened at 7:03 p.m. in the main room of the Hells Angels Inland Empire Clubhouse. 23 brothers around a long wooden table. No phones, no interruptions. Sacred time. Jolene sat at Gunner's left. She was the first woman who'd ever been invited to speak at an Inland Empire church meeting. Nobody questioned it, not because the club had suddenly reformed its traditions, but because the woman sitting in that chair had done things in the last week that commanded a respect that transcends tradition. Gunner opened. Preston suspended. But suspension isn't accountability. It's a paid vacation while lawyers negotiate a quiet exit. We need to understand the full scope, how long this has been happening, how many families were affected, and who else enabled it. Stonewall opened his laptop and turned it so the table could see. I pulled 4 years of dispatch logs and cross-referenced them with emergency calls from scanner archives, exactly the framework Jolene outlined. Found a clear pattern. He clicked through a spreadsheet. Rows of data color-coded organized by date, location, response time, and property value of the affected area. Last 4 wildfire seasons. 73 emergency calls from working class or remote areas. Average response time 8.4 hours. 17 of those calls resulted in property loss. 4 resulted in injuries, and 1 resulted in a death. The room went silent. Broadside pulled up a news article on his own laptop and turned the screen toward the table. September 2021. Doris Penfield, 68 years old, lived in a cabin at Valley Oaks, 4 miles from Ridgeline Summit. Wildfire jump containment. She called for evacuation assistance. Fire marshal's office classified her as Category 3. Response time, 11 hours. By the time crews arrived, her cabin was gone. They found her body in what was left of her bedroom. Official cause of death, smoke inhalation, and thermal injuries. Official finding tragic but unavoidable, given resource constraints during peak fire activity. He pulled up a second document. Here's the thing. Doris Penfield called for help at 2:14 p.m. on September 9th. At the exact same time, Preston deployed 3 engine companies and 2 helicopter units to Canyon Ridge Estates, a luxury development 8 miles south. Response time to Canyon Ridge, 47 minutes. 0 casualties. 0 property loss. Buckram, the construction foreman, spoke from across the table. His voice was quiet with the specific anger of a man who builds things and understands that some things once destroyed cannot be rebuilt. He chose. He had the resources. He chose to save the rich neighborhood and let the old woman die. Stonewall nodded. And it gets worse. Doris Penfield had a life insurance policy. $58,000. Beneficiary was her son, Howard Penfield, who'd been her caretaker and lived with her. 2 weeks after her death, Howard filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the county. The lawsuit was dismissed. Reason given was that resource allocation during emergency events is protected by qualified immunity. Fire marshal's decisions cannot be second-guessed in hindsight. Flintlock, the former teacher, leaned forward with his elbows on the table. So the legal system shielded Preston from accountability because emergency decisions are immune from review. The pattern didn't start with Brock's family. It's been operating for years, and the system protected it. Stonewall closed that folder and opened another. I found a second case. 2019, Riverside Terrace Mobile Home Park. Fire approaching. 43 families called for evacuation. Preston classified the entire park as Category 3 and diverted everything to Sunset Hills. Luxury homes average value $1.2 million. Riverside Terrace lost 18 mobile homes. 3 families were injured. 1 child, 7 years old, named Tommy Brewer, suffered severe smoke inhalation that caused permanent lung damage. He pulled up medical records. Tommy's medical bills over 3 years came to $137,000. His family went bankrupt. When they tried to sue the county for negligent response, same result. Dismissed under qualified immunity. The silence in the room had a weight to it. The kind of silence that settles when people who've been told all their lives that the system works are forced to look at the evidence that it doesn't. Jolene spoke for the first time. I've been thinking about this for 3 days, she said. Preston Whitmore is the name everyone will remember because his face was on television. But Preston is a symptom. He couldn't have operated this pattern for 4 years without institutional support. Someone above him approved the classification system. Someone handled the complaints when families objected. Someone made the lawsuits disappear. She looked around the table. I want to talk to the families. Doris Penfield's son, Tommy Brewer's parents. Every family in those 73 calls who was classified Category 3 and left behind. They're the evidence. Not the dispatch logs. Not the spreadsheets. The people. And people only talk when they trust the person asking. Gunner studied her. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that I go to them. Personally, not a lawyer, not a reporter, not the FBI. A mother whose 6-year-old daughter was 30 minutes from brain damage because of the same man who let Doris Penfield die and let Tommy Brewer's lungs get destroyed. I tell them my story, I ask them to tell me theirs, and I connect them to whatever investigation comes next. She paused. The FBI can subpoena records, but they can't make traumatized people trust them. These families have already been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect them. They filed complaints that were buried. They filed lawsuits that were dismissed. They have no reason to believe that this time will be different. Unless someone who understands what they went through looks them in the eye and says, I know because it happened to me too. Gunnar didn't put it to a vote. He didn't need to. Every brother at that table understood that the woman sitting in that chair had more right to lead this than anyone else in the room. Whatever you need, Jolene, we're behind you. Over the next 11 days, Jolene Harlan drove 740 miles across San Bernardino County. She visited Howard Penfield first at his apartment in Fontana, a one-bedroom unit he'd moved into after losing his mother's cabin and everything in it. He was 63 years old, living alone, working part-time at a hardware store because his caretaker experience didn't translate into the kind of credentials that employment agencies recognize. He opened the door and looked at Jolene with the wariness of someone who'd been visited by lawyers and reporters and county officials, all of whom had promised accountability and delivered nothing. My name is Jolene Harlan, she said. 3 weeks ago, the same fire marshal who let your mother die classified my 6-year-old daughter as not worth saving. 9 Boy Scouts hiked through a wildfire to get to us because Preston Whitmore decided our address wasn't valuable enough to justify a helicopter. Your mother didn't get 9 Scouts. She didn't get anyone. And I think about that every day. Howard Penfield stood in his doorway for a long time. Then he stepped aside and let her in. He talked for 2 hours about his mother's garden, about the phone call at 2:14 p.m. that was supposed to bring help, about the 11 hours of silence that followed, about finding her in the ash and knowing with a certainty that never faded that she died waiting for people who were never coming because someone with a desk and a formula had decided her cabin wasn't worth the fuel. He gave Jolene copies of every document he had, the 911 transcript, the dismissal of his lawsuit, the letter from the county attorney's office explaining why qualified immunity prevented the court from reviewing the fire marshal's operational decisions. At the end, he asked Jolene the question she'd been expecting. Why should I trust you? I trusted the lawyers. I trusted the county. I trusted the system. None of them did anything. Because I'm not the system, Jolene said. I'm the woman who was almost the next door's Penfield, and I'm not going to stop until the man who killed your mother faces what he did. She visited Tommy Brosher's family in Riverside. Tommy was now 10 years old. He carried a portable nebulizer in his backpack and couldn't run more than 50 yards without triggering an asthma attack that his lungs scarred permanently by smoke damage he'd suffered at 7 could no longer handle without mechanical intervention. His mother, a woman named Catherine, worked 2 jobs to cover medical bills that insurance only partially covered and that the county had refused to acknowledge were its responsibility. Catherine didn't want to talk. She talked before to reporters after the fire, to lawyers who'd taken her case and then dropped it when the qualified immunity ruling came down. Talking had produced nothing except the bone-deep exhaustion of telling your worst story to people who nod sympathetically and then disappear. Jolene didn't argue. She showed Catherine her phone, a photograph of Wren in the hospital bed, oxygen cannula IV line smiley face sticker on the gauze. Then a photograph of Wren from 2 days ago sitting up eating applesauce, wearing a new purple unicorn t-shirt that Redfield had brought to the hospital, along with 3 unicorn plush toys. My daughter is alive because 9 children decided she was worth saving, Jolene said. Your son is breathing through a machine because the same man who almost killed my daughter destroyed Tommy's lungs 4 years before he got to us. I can't fix what happened to Tommy, but I can make sure the people who did it to him can never do it to anyone else. Catherine looked at the photographs for a long time. What do you need from me? Your testimony, your medical records, your willingness to stand in a room and say what happened, not to a lawyer who'll file a motion and wait 3 years. To the FBI, the state fire marshal, and every camera that will point at you, publicly, on the record, so that no one can bury it this time. Catherine agreed. Over those 11 days, Jolene visited 9 families. She collected testimony documents, medical records, 911 transcripts, and the accumulated evidence of a pattern that had been operating in plain sight for 4 years, hidden not by secrecy, but by the calculated indifference of a system that treated working-class families as acceptable losses. When she was done, she had something no investigator, no journalist, no federal agent had been able to assemble. Not because they lacked the skills, but because they lacked the thing that made those families open their doors. Trust, the specific kind of trust that exists between people who share a wound. At 8:34 p.m. on a Tuesday, a woman named Special Agent Sarah Mitchell from the FBI's Los Angeles field office arrived at the Hells Angels clubhouse. 41 years old, dark blazer, practical shoes, the posture of someone who'd been running on coffee and obligation for longer than was healthy. Gunner met her at the door. "You're the FBI, Special Agent Mitchell. I'm told you have information relevant to an open federal investigation. Depends on what you're investigating. Fire Marshal Preston Whitmore. Resource allocation patterns, potential civil rights violations based on economic discrimination." Gunner looked at Jolene, who was sitting at the table with 4 file folders organized in the precise way she organized everything by severity, by date, by the weight of what each folder contained. "Come inside." Jolene presented the evidence. Not Stonewall, not Gunner, Jolene. She walked Agent Mitchell through every case, every family, every data point, every document. She showed the statistical pattern that Stonewall had built. She showed the personal testimony that she'd collected. And she showed the connection between the two, the human faces attached to the numbers, the names behind the gray dots on Preston Whitmore's color-coded map. Agent Mitchell reviewed each document with increasing focus. She stopped writing, set her pen down, leaned forward. "This fills a gap we haven't been able to close for 8 months," she said. "We had the statistical pattern, response time disparities across income demographics. We didn't have the internal documentation showing intent and enablement, and we didn't have the victim testimony connecting individual decisions to individual harm." She looked at Jolene. "How did you get these families to talk? We approached 3 of them months ago. They refused to cooperate." Jolene held her gaze. "I didn't approach them as an investigator. I approached them as a mother whose daughter almost died the same way their loved ones did. They didn't need someone to take their statement. They needed someone who understood what it feels like to call for help and hear nothing." Agent Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the practical question, "What do you need from us?" Jolene answered without hesitation. "Ren and our family get a victim advocate assigned before any interviews. Nobody talks to them without our consent. And whatever charges you file them within 30 days. Not after months of review. These families have been waiting years. They don't get to wait longer because the federal government moves slowly." Mitchell considered this. "I can agree to the victim advocate. Charges timeline depends on evidence authentication, but I'll push for expedited review." "One more thing," Jolene said. "There's a woman named Lorraine Beckett, Deputy County Administrator. She signed off on Preston's classification system in 2019. She personally intervened to get Howard Penfield's wrongful death lawsuit dismissed, and she buried 17 formal complaints filed against Preston over 4 years. 12 from residents, 5 from county fire personnel. Every single complaint went through her office. Every single one was dismissed as operational discretion." She placed the final folder in front of Agent Mitchell. Inside that folder was a set of documents that Jolene had obtained from her 9th visit. Not to a victim's family, to a 62-year-old man named Edgar Tillman. Edgar had worked in the San Bernardino County Emergency Services Department for 28 years as a logistics coordinator, the person who tracked resource deployment during emergencies. He'd retired 6 months before the Ridgeline Summit fire. He'd watched Preston's pattern operate for a decade. He documented it in private copies of memos and emails and complaint records stored in a desk drawer in his home office, like a confession he'd been writing for years but had never found the courage to send. When Jolene had knocked on his door, he'd answered wearing reading glasses and a cardigan, and the expression of a man who'd been expecting this visit the way people expect phone calls about test results they already know are bad. "I saw the news," he'd said quietly. "Those scouts did what I should have done 10 years ago." He'd given Jolene everything. The memos showing Preston's resource allocation formula. The emails from Lorraine Beckett approving the system. The complaint records, 17 in total, each one stamped with Lorraine's office review, and each one dismissed with the same language. Operational discretion, protected by emergency response protocols. And he'd said the thing that Jolene had known someone somewhere in the system needed to say. "I kept records because I told myself I was documenting for eventual accountability. The truth is, I was covering my own liability while people suffered. I'm 62 years old. I've got my pension, my house, my retirement, and I watched 9 children do what I was too afraid to do. I don't get to call myself a good person while staying silent anymore." Agent Mitchell read Edgar's documents. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at Jolene with the expression of a federal agent who has just received in a single evening more actionable evidence than her office had assembled in 8 months. We'll be in touch within the week, she said. And Mrs. Harlan, what you've done here, the family interviews, the evidence coordination, the witness recruitment, this is the kind of work that breaks cases. Most people wait for institutions to act. You acted and then brought the institutions the results. Jolene stood. I didn't do it to break a case. I did it because the next family that calls 911 from a cabin on fire shouldn't have to hope that Boy Scouts are listening. The consequences arrived on schedule. Preston Whitmore was formally charged with a criminal negligence in connection with the death of Doris Penfield and the injury of Tommy Brewer. The charges were state level because federal civil rights charges required proving discriminatory intent beyond pattern evidence, and prosecutors chose the faster path. He was never convicted. The case settled before trial with Preston accepting a permanent ban from emergency management surrender of all professional certifications and a financial settlement to the Penfield and Brewer families that was sealed by court order. He moved to Nevada. Last anyone heard, he was selling insurance in a strip mall outside Reno, far from California, far from the cameras, far from the people who knew what he'd done. Lorraine Beckett resigned under pressure 3 weeks after Agent Mitchell's visit. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons. The actual reasons included an FBI subpoena, the prospect of obstruction of justice charges, and a settlement agreement that included a permanent ban from public service. Edgar Tillman testified to the state fire marshal, to the FBI, and eventually to a congressional subcommittee examining emergency resource allocation practices nationwide. His testimony, combined with the Jolene's victim network, led to federal guidelines requiring transparency in resource allocation during disasters. The guidelines mandated that medical need and human vulnerability be primary factors in classification decisions, superseding property value, political influence, and every other variable that Preston Whitmore had built his career optimizing. San Bernardino County appointed a new fire marshal, Renee Garland, 45 years old, who'd spent 20 years in wildland fire management and whose first official act was implementing a resource allocation protocol that required medical need assessment to override property value in every emergency classification. The system that had failed 73 families was rebuilt. Not perfectly, not completely. Systems never change completely because the people who operate them carry their habits forward like sediment in a river. But the rules changed, and rules Jolene understood are the scaffolding that holds a system upright when the people inside it forget why it exists. 5 days after the rescue, Brock and Jolene brought Ren and Cody to the Hells Angels Inland Empire Clubhouse for dinner. The brothers had prepared a feast. Burgers, hot dogs, mac and cheese, fruit salad, cookies, shaped like motorcycles and scout emblems. The kind of food that children love and that adults prepare when they want to say something that words can't quite handle. Ren sat at a long picnic table between Declan and Sawyer wearing her purple unicorn t-shirt, the one that had been washed clean of ash but still bore the grass stains from 4 days ago, because some stains are evidence of a life lived before the fire and shouldn't be scrubbed away. She ate a cheeseburger slowly. Nobody rushed her. Nobody counted the minutes. The sound that had defined her existence for 3 days, that wet, rattling wheeze, was gone, replaced by normal breathing, by laughter when Pax told a knock-knock joke that didn't make sense, by the simple, ordinary sound of a 6-year-old being 6. Halfway through her burger, she looked at Declan. "You're the one who promised to bring me home." "I am. You kept your promise." Scouts always do. She reached into her ladybug backpack and pulled out a drawing, crayon on white paper. 9 stick figures wearing triangle hats surrounding a smaller stick figure with yellow hair and a purple shirt. Above them, a sun. Below them, in shaky 6-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for saving me." Declan took the drawing with hands that weren't steady. "Ren, this is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me. You can keep it forever." "I will, I promise." 2 weeks later at Pine Valley Campground, the exact spot where this had all started, the scouts and bikers gathered for a ceremony that nobody had planned, but everyone understood was necessary. Gunners stood in front of 9 scouts in full uniform, merit badge sashes gleaming in afternoon sunlight. Declan Ashford, Sawyer Engstrom, Nash Calloway, Briggs Tully, Kit Overland, Monty Drennan, Rowan Sutfield, Truett Lassiter, Pax Reinhardt. You are hereby granted honorary membership in the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club Inland Empire Chapter. You'll never wear our patch because you've already got your own and it means just as much. But you are our brothers. And if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call and we answer. That's not charity, that's family. He handed each scout a brass challenge coin. One side the Hells Angels emblem, the other side the Boy Scout emblem, engraved with the date, October 18th, 2025. The day Courage had 9 names. Then Declan did something nobody expected. He pulled out a hand-drawn topography map, his father's map, the one with annotations in blue pen and a coffee stain in the corner. Dated September 2018, folded into eighths in a crinkled plastic page protector. He walked to Ren, who was standing beside Jolene wearing a new purple unicorn t-shirt and pink sneakers. He knelt to her level. Ren, this map belonged to my dad. He taught me that heroes aren't special people with superpowers. They're just people who help when help is needed. Your mom's a hero. She kept you alive for 3 days with nothing but her training and her brain and the kind of love that doesn't quit. Your dad's a hero for never giving up, and you're a hero for holding on when it hurt. He held the map out to her. When you're older, I want you to teach someone else how to read this map. That's how we make sure there are always more heroes than villains. Ren took it carefully. The way children handle things they know are precious. I'll keep it safe forever. I know you will. Jolene watched her daughter hold a dead man's map and understood in the particular way that mothers understand things that this moment was not an ending. It was a hinge. The point where what had happened became what would happen next. February 14th, 2026, 4 months after the fire. Declan stood on the stage at the San Bernardino Civic Center in his full scout uniform, the blue bandana Gunnar had given him now tied around his neck, accepting the Medal of Honor from the National Scout Association. 8 scouts stood beside him. In the audience, their families, their troop county officials, news cameras, and 177 Hells Angels in polished vests and gleaming chrome sitting in respectful silence. The citation was read, "For extraordinary courage and selfless service in rescuing a family of 4 from imminent death during the October 2025 Ridgeline Summit wildfire. Advanced into active fire zone using merit badge training. Successfully evacuated and stabilized victims abandoned by official response. Actions resulted in 0 casualties, exposes systematic bias, and led to policy reforms." The medal was heavy. Declan hadn't expected that. After the ceremony, a woman approached him, mid-30s, professional clothes, carrying a folder. Dr. Megan Callister, professor of emergency management at USC. "I've been studying your rescue operation for 3 months," she said. "The route selection, the medical interventions, the coordination, the timeline, management. I want to incorporate your case into our curriculum. But more than that, I'm developing a pilot program, a partnership between youth organizations and community groups to create rapid response networks for situations where official systems fail or respond too slowly. Training young people in the skills you used, formalizing the kind of community protection you provided." She opened her folder. "I need an operations director. Someone with field experience, medical training, organizational ability, and credibility with both the communities we'd serve and the institutions we'd partner with." She looked past Declan. "I've been told that person is your rescuee's mother." Jolene was standing 6 feet away. She'd heard the entire conversation. Dr. Callister walked to her and extended her hand. "Mrs. Harlan, your name keeps coming up in every conversation I have about this program. The families you connected for the investigation, the evidence framework you built, the victim network you created. You did in 11 days what the FBI couldn't do in 8 months. She paused. "I'm calling it Angel's Watch. Would you consider running it?" Jolene looked at Declan, at Ren, who was showing Pax her father's map, at Gunnar, who was standing with his brothers. At the intersection of children and bikers and a system that had failed and the people who'd filled the gap when it did. What would the program need? Curriculum development, community partnerships, training facilities, a network of volunteers, and someone who understands what it feels like to be the person on the other end of the 911 call that nobody answers. Jolene didn't hesitate. "I'll do it, on one condition. The program's first class includes the families who were failed, not just as students, as teachers, because nobody understands why this matters better than the people who live through what happens when it doesn't exist." Angel's Watch launched in 7 California counties 3 months later. Jolene built it from the ground up, the same way she'd built the air filtration system in the cabin, with available resources, clear logic, and the absolute refusal to accept that the current situation was the best possible outcome. Enrollment in wilderness first aid courses increased 67%. Boy Scout applications in San Bernardino County tripled. Fire departments across the state implemented new protocols. And within 2 years, the program had expanded to 12 states, training over 400 young people in emergency response, and had successfully responded to 17 situations where official systems were too slow or too indifferent to act. 2 years to the day after 9 scouts ran into Wildfire, Ren Harlan stood in front of a room full of 23 teenagers at an Angels Watch orientation session. She was 8 years old, healthy lungs, no more daily maintenance inhaler, just a rescue inhaler she carried in her backpack as a precaution. She wore her Girl Scout uniform 47 days into membership, 3 badges earned already. She carried the hand-drawn topography map in its plastic protector, still precious, still teaching. My name is Ren Harlan. 2 years ago I was dying. The fire marshal said my family wasn't worth saving because we lived in a cabin instead of a mansion. He called us acceptable risk. The teenagers listened without moving. 9 Boy Scouts heard my dad on the radio begging for help. They were 11 to 14 years old. They hiked 3.8 miles into a wildfire because they decided I was worth saving, even when the adults didn't think so. But before they got there, my mom kept me alive for 3 days. She built a breathing system out of blankets and charcoal. She changed the scouts' route so they wouldn't die getting to us. She told a 13-year-old boy how to breathe for me. And when we got on the helicopter, she figured out that my lungs were filling with water and changed the way they were helping me breathe. The doctors said if she hadn't done that, I would have had brain damage. She unfolded the map. This map belonged to Declan Ashford's father. Declan gave it to me and told me to teach someone else how to read it. That's how we make sure there are always more heroes than villains. She walked to a girl in the front row, 15 years old, wearing a Girl Scout uniform, looking uncertain. The girl's name was Maya Whitfield. What's your name? Maya. Maya, have you ever needed help and nobody came? The girl's eyes filled. She nodded. Then you understand. That's why you're here. You know what it feels like to be left behind. And you decided nobody else should feel that way. That's how it starts. One person who decides that mercy matters more than convenience. She handed Maya the map. Learn this, then teach someone else. That's the promise. Maya took the map with shaking hands. I don't know if I'm brave enough. You are. You're here. That's the first step. After the session, Ren walked outside into bright October sunshine. Same month, different year. Safe now. She found Declan waiting by his car. He was 16 now, a junior in high school, already accepted early to UC Berkeley for emergency management studies, wearing the brass challenge coin on a chain around his neck. You did great in there. I learned from the best. She meant Jolene, and Declan knew it. They stood quietly watching the Angels Watch trainees file out of the building. 23 teenagers who just committed to being the kind of people who run toward trouble instead of away from it. Do you ever think about that day, Ren asked? October 18th. Every single day. Me too. But not the scary parts anymore. The good parts. The part where you promised on the radio and kept your promise. The part where 177 bikers showed up because 9 kids shamed them into action. The part where my mom figured out everything and told everyone what to do and didn't stop until we were safe. Declan was quiet for a moment. You want to know what I think about? I think about my dad, about the crane operator who saw the cable fraying and didn't stop the machine. And I think maybe my dad died so that I'd understand deep in my bones what it costs when someone chooses not to help. So when I heard your dad on the radio, there was no decision to make. I already knew what I had to do because I'd spent 4 years carrying the weight of what happens when someone doesn't. He looked at Ren. Your life mattered because every life matters. Not because you're special or important or valuable in some economic calculation. Just because you're a person who needed help. That's it. That's the whole thing. Ren hugged him. The fierce hug of an 8-year-old who remembers what it felt like to stop breathing and knows exactly who gave her back the ability to start again. That evening, Declan drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. He did this every October 18th, not out of obligation, out of need, a private ritual in the quiet hour before sunset. David Ashford's headstone was simple granite, name dates one line, beloved father and scout leader, always helpful. Declan sat on the grass beside the stone and pulled out the brass challenge coin, turned it over in his hand. Hey, Dad, 2 years since the fire. Ren's doing great. She's teaching other kids now, just like you taught me. Jolene built the Angels Watch program into something real. 12 states, 400 kids trained, 17 successful responses. She turned what happened to us into something that protects people. She's the strongest person I've ever met. He traced the scout emblem on the coin. I keep thinking about what you told me when I was 10, right before the accident. You said being a scout isn't about camping or knots or badges. It's about being someone people can count on when everything goes wrong. His voice broke slightly. I didn't save you. I was too young, too far away. But because I couldn't save you, I understood with my whole heart why I had to help save Ren. Why walking away wasn't possible. Why mercy matters more than safety. He placed the coin on the headstone for a moment, then picked it up and put it back around his neck. I love you, Dad. I'm trying every day to make you proud. He stood, brushed grass from his jeans, walked back to his car as the sun dropped behind the San Bernardino Mountains, the same mountains where 9 boys had run into fire 2 years ago, the same ridge line where a mother had kept her daughter alive with engineering and calculation, and the kind of love that doesn't calculate whether the odds are good enough to justify the effort. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, Declan happened to drive past Lincoln Elementary on his way to school. He saw her through the chain-link fence at recess. Ren, purple unicorn backpack, pink sneakers, running full speed across the playground, chasing another girl in a game of tag, laughing so hard her whole body shook with it. Running, without wheezing, without stopping, without the wet rattling sound that had defined her for 3 days in October. She saw him and ran to the fence. Declan, look. She spun in a circle, arms out. I can run so fast now. Dr. Pemberton says my lungs are totally healed. I'm the fastest in my whole class. She beamed with the uncomplicated pride of a child who has reclaimed something that was almost taken from her and doesn't yet understand how rare that second chance is. And I'm teaching my friend Emma to read maps. I showed her your dad's map. She thinks it's the coolest thing ever. The recess bell rang. Ren had to go. But before she ran back to her class, she said something that would stay with Declan for the rest of his life. My teacher asked what I want to be when I grow up. I said I want to be like my mom because she saved everybody and she didn't even have a badge. Then she was gone, running across the blacktop with her backpack bouncing and her sneakers flashing pink against gray asphalt. Just another first grader on just another Tuesday. But she wasn't. She was alive because a mother refused to accept that her daughter's life was worth less than a property tax assessment. Because 9 boys heard a father's voice on a radio frequency and chose to walk toward fire instead of away from it. Because 177 men on motorcycles remembered that brotherhood means showing up, especially when the system says don't bother. Declan stood at that fence and watched her disappear into the school building. He put his hand on the challenge coin beneath his shirt. Then he got in his car and drove to school thinking about his father, about Ren, about Jolene Harlan standing in a burning cabin, writing a script on the back of a cereal box that would save her daughter's life and expose a system that had been killing people for years and launch a program that would protect communities across the country. He was 16 years old. He'd helped save 1 life 2 years ago, but that 1 life had rippled outward through a mother's refusal to stop fighting, through families who finally found their voices, through a program now training hundreds of young people to be the help that the system sometimes isn't. That was the real legacy. Not the rescue itself, but what one woman built from the ashes of it.